Hey guys, tonight we're going to step away from the world you know. We're not just looking at artifacts behind museum glass or reading dry descriptions in a textbook. We're going to travel back to a time of ice and fire, to the warm, dark coasts of Scandinavia. And we're going to explore what life and more specifically, what intimacy, relationships, and power was really like in the Viking Age. And just a little heads up, this isn't the romanticized version you see in movies. If you were dropped into this world, with our modern sensibilities, you probably wouldn't last the first day. It was a tough, often brutal place, governed by rules that had very little to do with love and everything to do with survival. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It truly helps the channel find other people like you who enjoy drifting off to the strange and forgotten corners of history. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Go ahead and leave your city and the current time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see our little community of night owls spread across the globe. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes for a moment. Feel the air grow cold. The scent of pine and damp earth is sharp in your nose. You're walking toward a low, long building, almost like a massive, overturned boat half buried in the ground. This is a longhouse. From the outside, it seems almost silent, a beast sleeping in the great twilight. But as you push aside the heavy wooden door, a wall of sensory information hits you. The first thing you notice is the smoke. It stings your eyes and catches in your throat. There's a long, open fire pit, hanging out deep, running down the center of the hall. But there's no chimney, just a small, shuttered hole in the thatched roof above it. The smoke hangs in the air like a thick, soupy fog, coating every surface and every lung with a layer of soot. This ever-present haze is the price of warmth. Your eyes adjust, and through the gloom, you begin to make out the sheer scale of the space. It's one enormous room, perhaps 100 feet long. The earthen floor is hard-packed and uneven. Down the center, flanking the fire, are two raised earthen or wooden platforms that run the length of the building. These are the benches where everyone eats, works, and sleeps. Your status determines where you sit, and therefore, where you sleep. At the very center of one bench is the high seat, a more ornate chair, where the chieftain or patriarch of this clan sits. He is the sun around which this entire little world orbits. You, a newcomer, would be seated far down at the end, near the door, in the coldest and most vulnerable spot. The sounds are a low, constant murmur, the crackle and hiss of the fire, the bubbling of a great cauldron hanging over it, the soft thud of a woman weaving at a vertical loom in a corner, the scrape of a man sharpening a knife. You hear snippets of conversation in a language you don't understand. Old Norse, but the tones are universal. A sharp command, a low laugh, a tired sigh, and, underneath it all, a faint but distinct shuffling and an occasional snort from the far end of the longhouse, which you realize has been partitioned off for the livestock. Yes, you're sharing your living space with the cows and sheep. It's practical. The animal's body heat helps keep the place warm during the brutal winters. It also means the air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, red wood, boiling stew, old wood, and manure. This is the perfume of the Viking Age. There is no privacy here. None. Your entire life would be lived on this public stage. Every meal you eat, every word you speak, every sigh in your sleep is noted by the 20, 30, maybe even 40 other people sharing this space. This is a key detail, a piece of information that underpins everything else we're going to talk about. In a world without walls, your reputation is your only shield. A quirky little fact. Historians have found small, simple stone or soapstone lamps, little more than a shallow bowl, that would have held fish, oil, or animal fat with a wick. Imagine the smell of that burning or rancid, fishy odor mixing with the wood smoke and the livestock. Light was a precious, and likely smelly, commodity. Everything in this room, including the people, is assessed based on its usefulness. That man is valued for his strength in a raid. That woman for her skill in turning wool into cloth. The cauldron over the fire is valued for its ability to feed the household. Then you would be sized up immediately. What can you offer this group? Your worth isn't inherent. It is earned and constantly re-evaluated. This is a world built not on individual rights, but on communal obligation and a rigid hierarchy. The very architecture of this building screams it. And this is where we find our first point of academic contention. Historians and archaeologists still debate just how strictly this communal living was enforced. Some evidence suggests that families might have had small, curtained-off sections along the benches, creating tiny, flimsy rooms for a sliver of privacy. Others argue that this is a later development and that for much of the era, life was lived completely in the open. The sagas, the epic stories the Vikings told about themselves, are filled with scenes of people overhearing plots or witnessing secret encounters simply because there were no walls to stop them. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, unvaried from place to place. But the fundamental principle remains. Your life was not entirely your own. It belonged, in large part, to the clan you saw sitting around you in the flickering firelight. You're still sitting there, on that bench near the door, feeling the draft. The warmth of the fire only reaches you in flickering waves. But it's not just the cold that makes you feel uneasy. It's the weight of all those eyes. No one is staring at you, not openly, but you can feel the constant, peripheral awareness of the group. Every person in this longhouse is a piece in a complex, unspoken game, and you are the new, unknown piece on the board. You realize, in this moment, that the most fundamental currency in this world isn't silver or land, though those are certainly important. The true currency is intangible. It's a combination of two concepts that we don't really have direct equivalents for anymore. Honor and a kind of personal, spiritual love. Forget love. Forget personal happiness. Forget self-fulfillment. Those are modern luxuries. Here, life is a constant, ruthless effort to acquire and protect your family's honor and to align yourself with good fortune. Honor, horir, isn't an internal feeling of being a good person. It's your public reputation. It's a tangible, measurable thing. It's the sum of your deeds, your family's history, your wealth, and the respect you command from others. It can be increased by winning a battle, composing a great poem, hosting a generous feast, or making a powerful alliance through marriage. And it can be lost, chipped away, or stolen in an instant. A public insult, an act of cowardice, a broken oath, or a stingy offering to a guest. These are not just social faux pas. They are direct attacks on your honor, and they demand a response. If someone insults your wife or calls you a coward, you can't just let it go. To do so would be to admit the insult is true, diminishing your honor and, by extension, your family's standing in the community. This is why the sagas are so full of feuds that start over seemingly small slights and escalate into generations of bloodshed. They weren't just being petty. They were defending their most valuable asset. And this concept of honor is deeply intertwined with the theme of this journey. sexuality, and relationships. A man's honor was tied to his ability to lead, provide for, and protect his household. A woman's honor was linked to her management of the homestead, her fidelity, and her fertility. Every relationship, every birth, every union was a move in this grand game of honor. It was a public performance, and the entire community was the audience. This brings us to our weird little fact for the chapter. The concept of hamingja. This Old Norse word is often translated as luck, but that's a bit too simple. Hamingja was more like a personal life force, a spiritual power or fortune that resided within a person and their lineage. It was believed to be an almost physical quality that could be inherited. Like Eikulr, a great chieftain who was always victorious in battle and whose farms were always prosperous, was said to have a very strong hamingja. A person who was clumsy, sickly, or constantly failing was seen as having weak or no hamingja. And here's the strange part. It was thought that hamingja could be transferred. It could follow a family line, but it could also attach itself to a person who showed great promise. When a powerful old chieftain was dying, his hamingja was thought to be loose, looking for a new person to inhabit, usually a worthy successor. This belief had huge implications for relationships. When you sought a marriage partner, you weren't just looking at their wealth or family name. You were assessing their hamingja. Marrying into a lucky family was a way to bring that good fortune into your own bloodline. Conversely, a disastrous marriage could be blamed on a clash of two incompatible hamingjas. It adds a layer of mystical, fatalistic strategy to everything. You're not just marrying a person, you're trying to capture their look. Now, this leads us directly to a major point of debate among historians. How much free will did the Vikings believe they had? They had a powerful concept of fate. Urlan, the Norns, three mythical women, were said to weave the tapestry of every person's destiny at the moment of their birth. Your fate, including the day of your death, was preordained. So, if your life is already written, what's the point of striving for honor or hamingja? This is the great paradox of the Norse mindset, and scholars are still hashing it out. The prevailing theory is that while the destination, your death, was fixed, the journey was up to you. You couldn't choose if you died, but you could choose how you met your fate. The sagas are filled with heroes who know they are walking into a trap or facing an unwinnable battle. They go anyway. Why? Because the goal isn't to survive. The goal is to die well. The goal is to build a reputation that will outlive you. There's a famous line from the Havamel, a collection of Old Norse wisdom poems. Cattle die. Kinsmen die. You yourself must also die. But I know one thing that never dies. The reputation of the dead. That is the game. Your body is temporary. Your wealth can be lost. Your family will eventually pass. But your story, your honor, could achieve a kind of immortality. So use it there in the longhouse, an insignificant figure in the shadows, and you start to understand. Your personal feelings are a gentle breeze in a hurricane of larger forces. Your desire for love, comfort, or companionship is utterly secondary. The real questions being asked of you, silently, by everyone in this room are you honorable? Are you lucky? And what will your story be? Your answer to those questions will determine everything that happens next. You shift uncomfortably on the hard bench, the wood digging into your bones. The initial sensory overload of the longhouse is beginning to settle into a kind of murky normality. The smoke still stings. The smells are still potent. But your mind is adapting, trying to make sense of the human landscape around you. You start to notice the subtle differences between the people in the room. It's not just about who sits closest to the chieftain's high seat. It's in the quality of their clothes, the way they carry themselves, the deference or lack thereof they show to others. You're beginning to see the invisible lines that divide this society into its rigid tiers. To understand any relationship in the Viking Age, you first have to understand this social structure. It wasn't a fluid system where you could easily work your way up. It was more like a set of 3 distinct ladders, and the one you were born on was likely the one you'd die on. These were the Carls, the hierarchies, and the thralls. First, you see the hierarchies. This is the aristocracy, the elite. The chieftain of this longhouse is a jarl. His family, his closest retainers, they are the ones with the finest spun, brightly colored wool tunics, perhaps trimmed with imported silk. They might have a silver ring on their or more a delicate glass bead in their necklace. These aren't just decorations. They are billboards advertising wealth and power. They are the ones who own most of the land, the ones who can afford to build and outfit a longship, the ones who lead raids and command armies. Their honor is immense. Their hampinia is strong, and their lives are a constant performance of power. They host feasts, give generous gifts to their followers to ensure loyalty, and broker the most important marriages. Their children will marry other hierarchies, consolidating wealth and creating powerful, sprawling alliances across the land. They are the 1%. Then, you look at the majority of the people in the room. These are the Carls, the free farmers. They are the backbone of Norse society. They own their own land, a family farm called an oel. They carry weapons. They have the right to speak at the local assembly, the thing, and they form the bulk of any army or raiding party. Their clothes are sturdy in function, all undyed wool and linen. They are masters of their own domain, but they often swear loyalty to a powerful jarl for protection and a share of any plunder. Your typical Viking from popular culture is a Carl. They are proud, independent, and fiercely protective of their rights and their honor. Their marriages are just as strategic as those of the hierarchies, but on a smaller scale, aimed at combining adjacent farms or securing a skilled partner to help run the homestead. For a Carl, a good marriage isn't about climbing the social ladder into the jarl class that was nearly impossible, but about solidifying and improving their standing within their own tier. And then, you notice them, at the periphery, the ones who don't sit on the main benches, but on those stools, or perhaps just on the floor, the ones who scurry to refill drinking horns, who tend the fire, who clear away food scraps without a word. They are dressed in the co-rests, plainest rags. They meet no one's eye. These are the thralls, the slaves. The existence of thralls is the dark foundation upon which the entire Viking society is built. They have no rights, no honor, no hamingja. They are not legally people. They are property, chattel, no different from the cattle at the far end of the longhouse. A free man, a Carl, could be killed, and his family would be owed a hefty payment in silver, called a wergild, as compensation for their loss. If you killed a thrall, you simply paid their owner for the loss of property, the same way you'd pay for killing his cow. How did one become a thrall? There were many paths to this living hell. You could be born into it. The child of a thrall was a thrall. You could be captured in a raid on a foreign and Ireland, England, Russia, Spain. Vikings were prolific slave traders. Or you could be a fellow Scandinavian, captured in a local war. You could even become a thrall due to death. If a free farmer, the Carl, had a series of bad harvests and couldn't pay his debts, he and his entire family could be enslaved by their creditor. It was the ultimate social failure, the complete annihilation of a family's honor. Here we encounter a truly bizarre little detail of this system: the freedom purchase. In theory, a thrall could buy their own freedom if they could somehow acquire the money. Here, perhaps by selling crafts they made in their spare time, if any existed, or from a small plot of land their owner might allow them to use. More commonly, a relative might pay the price. But even if free, they didn't just become a carl. They entered a sort of social purgatory. A freedman, or Laysan GI, still owed a degree of loyalty and obligation to their former master. Their children would be one step closer to true freedom. But the full taint of slavery, from a social honor perspective, might take generations to wash away completely. The stigma was powerful. This is where academic debate heats up again. The exact proportion of thralls in Viking society is a hot topic. Some scholars, looking at the sheer scale of Viking slave trading operations, argue that thralls might have made up as much as 25%, or even more, of the population in some areas. Others argue this figure is inflated and that they were a smaller, but still significant, minority. The sagas, written by and for the upper classes, don't tend to dwell on the lives of thralls, so the archaeological evidence is key. Grave sites can offer clues. A burial with weapons and tools suggests a carl. A body unceremoniously dumped in a pit or buried with no grave goods might be a thrall. But the evidence is often ambiguous. Looking around the longhouse now, you see it with new clarity. You see the jarl and his family, radiating power. You see the carls, a sea of proud, watchful faces, each one the king of his own small world. And you see the thralls, the ghosts in the machine, their silent, tireless labor making the entire system possible. When we talk about marriage, love, or sex in this world, we cannot forget these three categories. A relationship between two jarls is a political merger. A relationship between two carls is a business partnership. And any relationship involving a thrall is not a relationship at all. It is an act of ownership. The rules, the expectations, and the consequences are entirely different depending on which ladder you're standing on. The cauldron over the fire is bubbling away, sending plumes of steamy, savor-smelling fog into the already thick air. Someone places a chunk of coarse, heavy bread and a wooden bowl of stew in front of you. It's simple, hearty food, probably barley, turnips, and whatever meat was available. As you eat, you watch the interactions. You see the chieftain's wife directing the thralls, a quiet, confident authority in her movements. You see men discussing the state of a boat's hull, their hands carving the air to describe its lines. Everything seems practical, grounded, and serious. Now, let's zoom in on a young man and a young woman from the carl class. The free farmers, let's say they're in their late teens. They've been seeing each other at feasts and local assemblies. Perhaps they share a smile. Maybe she is impressed by her quick wit, or she's noticed his strength in the mock wrestling games. Is this the beginning of a love story? Absolutely not. Put that idea right out of your head. This isn't a date. It's a preliminary market assessment. In the Viking Age, especially for the property-owning classes of jarls and carls, marriage had almost nothing to do with romantic love. It was a business transaction. It was the most important economic and social contract a person would enter into in their entire life. The goal was not to find a soulmate. The goal was to form a successful partnership that would strengthen both families, ensure the continuation of the bloodline, and create a stable, prosperous household. Think of it like a corporate merger. The young woman's family has a well-run farm with healthy livestock in a good location near a river. The young man's family has a smaller farm but owns a share in a trading vessel and has a reputation for producing skilled warriors. A union between them makes perfect sense. Her family gets access to his family's trade network and the protection of their fighters. His family gets the stability of her family's land and resources. It's a strategic alliance. Pure and simple. The individuals involved, the young man and woman, were often secondary to the negotiation. Their personal feelings were a pleasant bonus, but not a prerequisite. In many cases, especially within the Jarl class, the couple might not even meet until the betrothal negotiations were well underway. A marriage was arranged by the heads of the families, the father, or perhaps an influential uncle or older brother. Their primary concern was not the happiness of the couple, but the profit the union would bring to the wider clan. The value of the bride was calculated with cold, hard pragmatism. What did she bring to the table? First, her family's wealth and status. Second, her own skills. Was she a good weaver? Did she know how to manage a dairy? Could she oversee the household servants and preserve food for the long winter? These were vital managerial skills. A Viking homestead was a complex business, and the wife was its COO. Her competence was a direct economic asset. And third, and most importantly, her perceived fertility. Her primary job was to produce heirs, preferably sons, to inherit the family property and continue the lineage. The groom's value was assessed just as clinically. Did he come from a family with a strong ham in your good luck? Was he a proven warrior who could defend the home and bring in wealth from raiding? Was he a shrewd farmer who knew how to manage land? Was he known to be level-headed and not prone to starting foolish blood feuds that could bankrupt the family? This brings us to a strange and slightly uncomfortable little fact about this whole process. Public inspection. While we don't have explicit descriptions of this, the sagas contain enough hints to suggest that a person's physical attributes were openly discussed as part of the marriage assessment. Sagas often describe heroes and heroines in great detail, noting their height, hair color, and physical build. A man might be praised for being tall and strong, a woman for having long, beautiful hair, often a sign of good health and breeding. There are even hints that a potential suitor or his representative might try to get a look at a prospective bride's hands and feet to judge her delicacy, or a man's bare chest to judge his strength. It was all part of the due diligence. A saga might casually mention a man being rejected as a suitor because he had unflattering legs or was clumsy. It wasn't about vanity. It was about judging the quality of the stock. This leads to a point of academic discussion. To what extent did the individuals have a say? The legal texts, like the GRA from Iceland, suggest that a woman had to give her consent to the marriage for it to be legally binding. But what did consent really mean in this context? Scholars debate whether this was a genuine power of veto or more of a formality. Imagine being a 16-year-old girl. Your father, the powerful patriarch of your family, has just negotiated a brilliant match for you that will secure your family's future. Are you really going to say no? The social pressure would have been immense. The sagas do contain stories of women who resist arranged marriages, but these are often the central conflict of the story, highlighting how exceptional and disruptive such an act would be. The default was to accept the wisdom of your elders. The family unit, the clan, was paramount. Your personal desires were subordinate to the good of the group. So, you watch that young man and woman across the longhouse. You might see a flicker of interest, a shared glance. But now you understand what's really happening. It's not a spark of romance. It's the first flicker of a potential merger. Their minds, and the minds of their families, are not filled with poetry and passion. They are filled with calculations, acres of land, heads of cattle, a share in a ship, the strength of an arm, the width of a hip, and the invisible, all-important currency of honor and blood. The process about to unfold is not a courtship. It's a negotiation. The feast in the longhouse continues. The drinking horns, often made from the horns of a ewe or ox, are passed around, filled with a larmead. As the night wears on and the drink flows, the talk becomes louder, the boasts bigger. But even in this state of revelry, the serious business of life is never far from the surface. Let's follow the father of the young man we were just watching. H.E.S. seen the way his son looked at that young woman. He knows her family. H.E.S. done the calculations in his head. The potential alliance is strong. It's time to move from assessment to action. What happens next is not a charming, heartfelt request for a daughter's hand in marriage. This is the beginning of a formal, and often tough, negotiation. The process of arranging a marriage was called the festmahl, the agreement speech, and it was as serious as any modern-day business deal. The suitor's family, usually the father or a male guardian, the BAUGRYGR, would make a formal visit to the bride's family. This was a casual drop-in. It was a planned event, a delegation. The suitor himself might come along, but he was not the main speaker. His job was to look presentable and not say anything foolish. The negotiation was handled by the men in charge. They would sit down, likely with witnesses present, and the suitor's father would make his case. He would then talk about law over how his son was smitten. He would talk about assets. He would lay out what his son brought to the table, his inheritance, his reputation, his skills. He was essentially presenting a business prospectus. Then came the two key financial components of any Viking marriage contract, the dowry and the bride price. These terms can be a bit confusing because they sound similar, but they serve very different purposes. The dowry, known as the hymen fyolgia that which follows her from home, was the wealth the bride brought with her into the marriage. This could include land, livestock, household goods, jewelry, and money. Crucially, this property remained hers. It did not become her husband's. He could manage it and use the income it generated for the household, but he could not sell it without her permission. If he died, or if they divorced, she took her dowry back. This was her safety net, her personal stake in the marriage. A generous dowry made a bride more attractive and also gave her a degree of influence within her new home. Then there was the bride price, or mundar. This was the sum of money or property that the groom's family paid to the bride's family. Now, this is often misinterpreted as the groom buying a wife. That's not quite right, and the distinction is important. The mundar was not a payment for the bride, as if she were a piece of property. It was a payment to her guardian, a compensation for the loss of his authority over her. It was a transfer of legal guardianship. More importantly, this money was also meant for the bride's security. While legally paid to her father or guardian, it was considered her long-term property. In the event of a divorce where the husband was at fault, or upon his death, the mundar was paid out to her. It was her personal retirement fund and insurance policy rolled into one. Here's our quirky detail for this section. The negotiation could get incredibly specific. The law codes that have survived, like the Icelandic GRA gas, contain detailed rules for these transactions. The mundar had a minimum legal value, but it was often negotiated much higher for prominent families. The negotiations would specify exactly what was included in the dowry, not just livestock, but 10 ewes, 2 cows, and 1 breeding boar. Not just household goods, but 1 cauldron, 6 sleeping fires, and a loom. Everything was itemized. This wasn't about a lack of trust. It was about clarity. In a world where your honor and legal standing depended on contracts, having everything spelled out in front of witnesses was essential to prevent future disputes. There are saga accounts of feuds starting because a father-in-law was slow to hand over a promised cow. This meticulous, legalistic approach to marriage leads to a fascinating debate among historians. Was this system liberating or oppressive for women? On one hand, it seems incredibly cold and objectifying. A woman is discussed and valued like a prize mare. Her own feelings are a footnote. On the other hand, the system provided women with a surprising amount of legal and economic protection. The fact that her dowry was her own, and that the bride price was essentially her financial security, gave her a status far beyond that of a mere possession. She entered the marriage not as a dependent, but as a stakeholder, a partner in the firm with her own capital. Historians are still untangling this paradox. Was she a product being traded or a shareholder in a new venture? The answer is probably a complex and uncomfortable both. So, imagine the scene. Two patriarchs, two girls, sitting across a table in the longhouse. The air is tense with calculation. My son will inherit the south field, and he gets a 1/8 share of the ship's sea serpent. One says. The other might counter. My daughter's dowry will be 12 sheep and a chest of fine linen. But your son's reputation for hot-headedness concerns me. The Munder will need to be higher to reflect that risk. They haggle. They posture. They debate. It could take hours, even days. The young couple in question might be sitting there in silence, their entire futures being decided by this verbal tug-of-war over property and honor. Once the terms were agreed upon, hands were shaken, and the betrothal was sealed. It was a binding, public contract. To break it would bring immense dishonor to the offending family. The deal was done. The wedding could now be planned. The deal has been struck. The negotiations are over. The terms agreed upon. The handshakes exchanged in front of witnesses. A sense of relief and finality settles over the two families. Now, the atmosphere in the longhouse shifts. The tension of the fest or mal gives way to the boisterous anticipation of the bouquet up the wedding feast. This wasn't just a party. It was the public ratification of the contract. A celebration that could last for 3 days, or even a week if the families were wealthy enough. Let's imagine you are an invited guest. You arrive at the groom's family longhouse, which has been scrubbed as clean as possible for the occasion. Fresh rushes might be strewn on the floor to cover the hard-packed earth and mask the usual smells. The fire in the center of the hall burns brighter and higher than usual. The family's finest tapestries, depicting scenes from myth and legend, might be hung on the walls. The sheer amount of food and drink is staggering. This feast was a critical component of the wedding, as it demonstrated the wealth and generosity of the host family, boosting their honor in the eyes of the community. To host a meager wedding feast was a public embarrassment before the feasting begins in earnest. However, there are rituals to perform. The bride, on the day of her wedding, would undergo a symbolic transformation. She would likely take part in a ritual bath, a ceremonial cleansing to wash away her maidenhood. Her hair, which as a young, unmarried girl she would have worn long and loose, would now be braided and pinned up, a sign of her new status as a married woman. She would put away the clothes of her childhood and don the attire of a wife. The groom, too, would have his rituals. He might visit his family's burial mound to commune with his ancestors, seeking their blessing for the union. His central symbolic act involved a sword, a family sword, an heirloom passed down through generations, would be given to him by his father. He would then use this sword in a ceremony, perhaps striking it against the rafters of the house to symbolically take possession of his new household. Then comes the central public moment of the wedding. It's not a vow exchange like we have today. Instead, it's a series of symbolic transfers of power. One of the most important involved the bride's father formally handing over the bride to the groom. But the most iconic ritual, the one that truly defined the bride's new role, was the handing over of the keys. The groom's mother, the current matriarch of the household, would present the bride with a set of keys. These weren't just for a single door. These were the keys to the food store, the pantry, the chests of linen and valuables. They were the symbol of her new authority. By accepting these keys, she was formally taking over the management of the household's domestic sphere. She was now the S3X Freyja, the lady of the house. Her mother-in-law was officially stepping down, retiring from her post. This transfer was a massive deal, a public declaration that a new woman was now in charge of the family's internal economy. Now for our little quirky fact. The wedding ceremony often involved the god Thor. While we think of Thor as the god of thunder and battle, he was also a major patron of marriage, community, and contracts. A symbol of his hammer would be invoked for a blessing. One ritual described in the poems involves placing a replica of the hammer in the bride's lap as she sat on the high seat. This was done to bless the union, ward off evil, and, most importantly, to promote fertility. The hammer of the mighty thunder god, lying in the lap of the new bride, was a powerful and not so subtle prayer for many healthy children to come. The feast itself was a raucous affair. Ale and mead flowed freely. A skald, a court poet, might be on hand to recite epic poems about the deeds of the family's ancestors, further cementing their honor. There would be toasts, boasts, and the giving of gifts. The guests would present the newlyweds with wedding presents, practical things that a new household would need. And in return, the host family would give gifts to their most important guests. It was all part of the intricate web of reciprocity and honor. This brings us to a point of scholarly debate. Was the Viking wedding a religious ceremony or a legal one? The answer, as is often the case, is that it was both. And the distinction we make today didn't really exist for them. The legal contract of the Festarmel was what made the marriage official in the eyes of the law. But the public feast, the blessings from the gods like Thor, the ancestral rituals, these were what made the marriage real in the eyes of the community and the cosmos. The legal and the sacred were completely intertwined. Some scholars argue the legal aspects were paramount, pointing to the detailed law codes. Others insist that the religious and traditional rituals were the true heart of the ceremony, grounding the new union in the sacred order of the world. It's likely the Vikings themselves would have been confused by the question. A promise made before your community was a promise made before the gods. As the wedding feast rages around you, you look at the bride and groom, sitting side by side in the place of honor. She, with her newly pinned up hair and the keys at her belt. He, with his ancestral sword by his side. They are no longer just a boy and a girl. They are the new nucleus of a household, the fresh link in a chain of ancestors stretching back into the mist of time. The contract has been signed. The symbols have been exchanged. They are now husband and wife. But the final part of the process, the one that truly consummates the deal in every sense of the word, is yet to come. The wedding feast has reached its peak. The Skald's voice booms over the drunken chatter. The fire roars, and the longhouse is filled with a chaotic, celebratory energy. But as the night deepens, a different kind of anticipation begins to build. The final, crucial step of the marriage process is about to take place. This is not a private, romantic moment for the newlyweds to quietly slip away. The consummation of the marriage was, in its own way, a public event, and it had a vital legal significance. The modern idea of a private, intimate wedding night would have been utterly alien to the Vikings. Remember, the longhouse is one giant room. There is no bridal suite. The couple would retire to a designated bed, which might be in a slightly more enclosed part of the bench system, perhaps with a curtain or a wooden partition for a sliver of privacy. But the key word here is sliver. Everyone in that longhouse knew exactly what was happening. Before the couple retired, a procession would take place. Several witnesses, usually close relatives from both families, would escort the bride and groom to the marriage bed. They would carry torches or lamps, illuminating the path. This wasn't about being nosy or intrusive, at least not in their view. This was a formal, legal requirement. The marriage was not considered fully and irrevocably sealed until it had been consummated. And in a world without written certificates, the testimony of witnesses was the only proof that the act had occurred. So, you have to picture the scene. The young couple, who may barely know each other, are led to their bed by their parents and a handful of other respected community members. These witnesses would then wait outside the small, curtained-off area. They weren't watching, but they were there. Their presence confirmed that the couple had entered the bed together with the intention of consummating the union. This public acknowledgement was the final stamp on the legal contract. The next morning, the witnesses would be there again. Their role was to formally attest that the marriage was now complete. This confirmation was critical. If, for some reason, the marriage was not consummated, it could be grounds for annulment. The whole deal, the negotiations, the dowry, the bride price could be called off. This put immense pressure on the couple, especially if they were nervous or inexperienced. Their performance had real legal and financial consequences for their entire families. This is where we find our curious little detail, one that highlights the legalistic nature of Norse society. The Icelandic law code, the GRA gas, is incredibly specific about this. It states that for a marriage to be legally valid, the couple must share a bed openly. It even legislates against secret marriages. If a couple eloped and married in secret without the public feast and witnesses, the union had no legal standing. The woman would have no claim to her dowry or the bride price, and any children they had would be considered illegitimate, with no inheritance rights. The law was designed to protect the integrity of the family and property system. It demanded transparency. Your love life, at least at the beginning, was the community's business. This public aspect of the wedding night is also a source of ongoing academic debate. The central question is, how public was it? Really? The sagas, which are our main narrative source, are notoriously tricky. They were written down centuries after the events they describe, often by Christian scribes who might have exaggerated or misunderstood pagan customs. Some scholars take the accounts of witnessed consummation quite literally, arguing it was a standard, formal procedure. Others are more skeptical. They suggest that the witnessing might have been more symbolic. Escorting the couple to the bed was enough, and no one actually hung around to listen. They argue that the sagas might be playing up the more barbaric aspects of their ancestors for dramatic effect. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. The level of formality probably varied by region and the status of the family. For a high-stakes dual marriage, where a massive alliance was being forged, the witnessing might have been a very real and serious procedure to ensure there weren't no loopholes. For a simple marriage between two couples in a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew each other, it might have been more of a knowing nod and a shared drink before leaving the couple to themselves. But the underlying principle remains the same. regardless of the exact mechanics. The consummation was the physical act that turned a financial and legal contract into a binding reality. It was the moment the merger was finalized, the moment the two family businesses officially became one. It wasn't about passion. It was about sealing the deal. So, as the sounds of the feast finally begin to die down and a sleepy quiet descends on the longhouse, you can imagine the young couple in their new bed, the weight of expectation from their families, the silent awareness of the entire community just a few feet away, the knowledge that their actions in this moment have legal and financial ramifications that will last a lifetime. It's a far cry from the modern ideal of a romantic wedding night. It was the final, and perhaps most stressful, step in a long and calculated business transaction. Only after this night is truly over can the real work of their new life running a farm, managing a household, and, most importantly, producing an heir begin. The morning after the wedding feast is a stark contrast to the revelry of the night before. The fire has died down to glowing embers, and the longhouse is filled with the groans of hung-over guests and the smell of stale ale. But for the new bride, there is no time to rest. Her new life, and her new job, begins today, with the keys to the household now metaphorically, and perhaps literally at her belt. She steps into one of the most powerful roles a woman could hold in Norse society. The S3X, the lady of the house. We often have this image of Viking women as either shield maidens fighting alongside men or as passive figures waiting at home. While the historical evidence for shield maidens is a subject of intense debate, the power of the S3X is undisputed. It was a role of immense responsibility and authority. The longhouse and the farm were divided into two spheres of influence: the uti-vista or outdoor work, and the in-IVR store, indoor work. The man was in charge of the outdoors farming, hunting, fishing, writing, and politics. But the moment he stepped across the threshold of the longhouse, he was entering his wife's domain. You, as the new bride, are now the manager of a complex domestic economy. Your first task is to take stock of your resources. You unlock the pantry and the storehouses. How much dried fish is there? How much grain? How much cured meat? You must calculate how to make these provisions last through the long, brutal Scandinavian winter. A miscalculation could mean starvation for your entire household, which might include not just your immediate family but also various relatives, farmhands, and thralls. Your domain includes all textile production. You oversee the shearing of the sheep, the cleaning and carding of the wool, the spinning of the thread, and the weaving of the cloth on the large, upright loom. Clothing was incredibly labor-intensive to produce and therefore very valuable. A surplus of cloth, or a particularly fine sail for a ship, could be a significant source of income for the family. You would manage a team of women daughters, female relatives, and thralls to get this work done. You are also the head chef and brewmaster. You decide the daily meals and oversee their preparation in the great cauldron. You are in charge of making the ale and mead that are essential for social life and for hosting guests. A critical part of maintaining the family's honor. You are the chief medic, responsible for knowing which herbs to use for treating illnesses and injuries. You are the dairy manager, overseeing the production of butter, cheese, and a yogurt-like food called skyr, which were vital sources of protein and fat. In essence, you are the chief operating officer of the entire homestead. Your husband might be the CEO, making the big strategic decisions about alliances and acquisitions. But you are the one running the day-to-day operations. The sagas are full of examples of formidable wives who are consulted by their husbands on all important matters. A wise man did not make a major decision without listening to the counsel of his S3X. Her practical knowledge of the household's resources and her social intelligence were invaluable. This brings us to a curious little detail. The key holder status was so central to a wife's identity that it was reflected in their burials. Archaeologists have found numerous female graves from the Viking Age where the deceased woman was buried with a set of keys, often worn on a chain or attached to her belt. Sometimes, she would be buried with other symbols of her domestic power, like a spindle whorl for spinning or a weaving sword. These weren't just sentimental trinkets. They were the equivalent of a modern professional being buried with the tools of their trade. It was a statement about their identity and the source of their power in life. The precise balance of power between husband and wife is, of course, a topic of scholarly discussion. The law codes, written by men, naturally emphasize the husband's ultimate authority. He was the legal head of the household and her legal guardian. He could, in certain extreme circumstances, legally chastise his wife. However, the narrative evidence from the sagas often paints a much more nuanced picture. They show us women who are clever, assertive, and who frequently manipulate their husbands to get what they want. They incite them to avenge insults. They devise clever legal strategies, and they manage family feuds from behind the scenes. Scholars like Judith G.S.C.H. argue that we should see the household as a partnership. While the husband held the firm legal power, the wife wielded immense practical and social power. Her control over the household's resources, food, cloth, and hospitality gave her enormous leverage. A guest who was welcomed warmly and feasted generously by the S3X would leave with a high opinion of the family's honor. A wife who was stingy or incompetent could damage the family's reputation just as surely as a husband who was a coward in battle. So, as you stand there in the quiet morning light of the longhouse, the keys feeling heavy and real in your hand, you understand the true nature of your new position. You are not a servant. You are not a passive bystander in your husband's life. You are his partner, the anchor of his household, the guardian of its honor and prosperity. The man may go out to fight and trade, seeking glory and wealth in the wider world. But it is here, within these smoky, timbered walls, that the foundation of that world is built and maintained, and you are now its manager. The success or failure of this entire enterprise rests as much on your shoulders as it does on your husband's. The first few months, perhaps even years, of your new life as a S3X are a whirlwind of activity. You master the rhythms of the seasons, the management of the livestock, the intricate politics of the household. You and your husband develop a working partnership, a routine built on the foundation of that initial, cold transaction. You might even develop a genuine affection and respect for each other. But hanging over this new life, over every meal prepared and every piece of cloth woven, is one enormous, unspoken pressure, the need for an heir. Everything we've discussed so far, the honor, the alliances, the property was all geared towards one ultimate goal: continuation. A family line that ended was a failure. A farm without an heir to would be broken up and absorbed by others. The entire purpose of this carefully constructed marriage was to produce the next link in the chain. And while the responsibility for this was technically shared, in practice, the burden fell most heavily on you, the wife. The moment you become pregnant is a moment of quiet triumph for the household. But the anxiety doesn't end there. The pregnancy itself is fraught with danger in an era without modern medicine. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. Every birth was a life or death gamble. But assuming you survive, the next critical hurdle is the child itself. As soon as the baby is born, It would be placed on the floor before your husband, the father. He would then perform a crucial act known as iusavetni, or to sprinkle with water. He would inspect the infant. If he judged it to be healthy and well-formed, he would pick it up, sprinkle it with water, give it a name, and formally accept it into the family. This act conferred legitimacy and the right to be raised. But if the father judged the child to be sickly, deformed, or for some reason unacceptable, he had the legal right to refuse it. This meant the child would be taken out and exposed, left in the wilderness to die. This practice, known as utibur, is one of the harshest realities of Viking society. It sounds monstrous to our ears, but from their pragmatic perspective, it was a grim necessity. In a world of scarce resources, a child who was not likely to survive to adulthood, or who would be a permanent drain on the family, was a liability they couldn't afford. It was also sometimes used for female infants, especially if the family already had several daughters and desperately needed a son to inherit. The family needed productive members, not dependents, and the need for a son was paramount, while daughters were valuable for creating marriage alliances. It was a son who would inherit the ancestral land, the Oreo. It was a son who would carry on the family name and the family's honor. It was a son who would grow up to be a warrior, to defend the farm, and to provide for you and your husband in your old age. The pressure to produce a male heir was immense. If you had daughter after daughter, it would be seen as a great misfortune, a sign of weak aminya. This brings us to our weird little fact for the chapter, which revolves around a strange legal loophole for a child's legitimacy. Let's say a man dies while his wife is pregnant. When the child is born, who has the authority to accept it into the family and grant it inheritance rights? The law codes stipulated a fascinating procedure. The mother had to take the newborn child to the local assembly. The thing. There, she would have to find a foster father or sponsor, a respected man who would agree to perform the naming and water sprinkling ritual, to prove the child was indeed the heir. She was required to produce witnesses who could testify that she and her husband had shared a bed within the last 10 months. It's another example of how deeply public and legalistic the most private moments of life were. The question of infanticide, the utibur, is a significant area of academic debate. While the Loch Odin sagas make it clear that it was a legal right of the father, historians and archaeologists are still trying to figure out how common it actually was. The archaeological evidence is sparse. The tiny bones of an infant left in the wilderness would not survive long. Some scholars argue that it was likely a rare event, reserved for the most extreme cases of deformity or famine. They suggest that social pressure and basic human affection would have made it a difficult choice for any parent. Others believe it might have been more common than we think, a grim-to-love family planning in a harsh world. The folklore of the later Scandinavian period is filled with tales of the ghosts of exposed infants. The utiburi are or mylingar, who haunt the places they were abandoned, suggesting the practice left a deep and lasting scar on the collective psyche. If you failed to produce any children at all, it was a disaster for the marriage. A childless union was seen as pointless, a failed contract. While they wouldn't have understood the biology of infertility as we do, the blame was almost always placed on the wife. If, after a few years, no children were born, this was considered legitimate grounds for your husband to divorce you. He could send you back to your family, you would get your dowry back, of course, and marry someone else, someone hopefully more fertile. Your value as a partner was inextricably linked to your womb. So, as you hold your newborn child for the first time, waiting for your husband's judgment, you feel the crushing weight of this reality. This tiny, fragile life is not just a baby. It is a symbol. It is the future of the farm, the continuation of a bloodline, the living embodiment of your success or failure as a wife. Your entire standing in this community, your honor, and the very survival of your new family all hinge on this one critical outcome. Let's say the years have been kind to you. You've proven your worth as a HUS Freja. The stores are full, the household runs smoothly, and most importantly, you have provided your husband with what he needed most, a healthy son to be his heir, and perhaps a few daughters to be used as future bargaining chips in the alliance market. Your position is secure. Your marriage, born of a cold transaction, has settled into a stable, mutually beneficial partnership. Your husband respects your counsel, and you hold the undisputed power within the walls of the longhouse. But now, a new complication might arise. One day, your husband returns from a trading voyage or a successful raid, and he doesn't come back alone. He brings with him another woman. She is not a thrall, not a slave to be put to work with the others. She is treated with a degree of respect. She is given decent clothes and a place to sleep on the benches. But she is clearly not your equal. She is a frillet. The frillet was, for lack of a better modern term, an official concubine or mistress. This was a recognized, though not legally protected, social institution in Viking society. A powerful and wealthy manager, or even a prosperous Carl, was permitted to have one or more friller in addition to his legal wife. This was not considered cheating or infidelity in the modern sense. It was a display of status. Having multiple women was a sign of a man's wealth, power, and virility. It was another way to project honor and success. The frillet was typically from a lower social class than the man, or she might be a captive from a foreign land who was not formally enslaved. The relationship was based on mutual consent, but the power dynamic was obviously skewed. She entered the relationship willingly, but she had none of the legal protections of a wife. There was no bride pricement or Ordauerheimenef YLG. The contract was purely informal. She could be dismissed at any time, for any reason. As the legal wife, the HUS Freja, your reaction to this new arrival would be complex. On one hand, it was not a direct threat to your legal standing. You were the one with the keys. You were the manager of the household. Your son was the sole legal heir to the family property. The frillet could never usurp your position. Her role was entirely separate. On the other hand, it would have been a bitter pill to swallow. It was a daily, public reminder of your husband's divided affections and a challenge to your personal authority within the home. The sagas are filled with tales of the bitter rivalries between wives and concubines, of the tension and strife they brought to a household. This is where we find our peculiar detail for the chapter, the status of the children. What happened to the children born from a union between a man and his frillet? They occupied a gray area in the social and legal system. They were not thralls, but they were not fully legitimate heirs either. They were known as Oskilgetin, or illegitimate. They could not inherit the primary family property, the Oreal. That was reserved for the son of the legal wife. However, they were not completely cast out. A father had a social and moral obligation to acknowledge and support his illegitimate children. He would often give them gifts of property or money to help them get started in life. Sometimes, if a man had no legitimate sons from his wife, he could choose to formally adopt his son by a frillet, making him the legal heir. This required a special public ceremony, a kind of adoption ritual, to elevate the child's status. This created a huge amount of potential family drama. Imagine the tension. The legal wife is unable to produce a son, while the lower status frill gives birth to a healthy boy. The future of the entire family lineage would then rest on this illegitimate child, creating a deeply awkward and often resentful dynamic in the longhouse. The exact rights and social standing of the thrall and her children is a topic of ongoing historical debate. The sources are often contradictory. Some law codes seem to grant illegitimate children certain limited inheritance rights to their father's personal property, but not the ancestral land, while others do not. Some sagas portray the thrall as a respected member of the extended household, while others show her as a source of constant conflict, scorned by the legitimate wife. It's likely that the reality varied greatly depending on the personalities involved and the specific circumstances. If the wife was powerful and assertive, she might make the thrall as life miserable. If the husband was particularly fond of his thrall and her children, he might go to great lengths to provide for them, causing resentment. Scholars are still trying to piece together the legal and social puzzle. Was the thrall an accepted part of a polygynous family structure? Or was she a tolerated but destabilizing presence? The answer probably depends on which household you walked into. For you, the H.U.S. Fraser, the arrival of a thrall is a test of your power and your composure. You hold all the legal cards. You are the queen of this small kingdom. But now there is another woman living under your roof, sharing your husband, and producing children who, while not your son's legal rivals, are still a part of the family's complex web of relationships. It adds another layer of emotional and social complexity to the already crowded public life of the longhouse. Your partnership with your husband was a business deal. His relationship with the thrall is something else, perhaps based on affection, perhaps just on status. Either way, her presence is a constant, quiet challenge you must now manage. Life in the longhouse continues. A delicate balance of power between you, your husband, and now, perhaps, a thrall lingering in the background. The partnership you formed, that critical business alliance, was designed for stability. But what happens when the foundation of that deal begins to crack? What happens when one party no longer holds up their end of the bargain? In a society so fixated on contracts and reciprocity, it should come as no surprise that there was a mechanism for dissolving the arrangement. Divorce? The concept of a Viking divorce is startlingly modern in some ways and brutally pragmatic in others. Just as marriage was a public contract, divorce was a public declaration that the contract was void. It wasn't about irreconcilable differences or a lack of love. It was about a material breach of the marriage agreement. The entire process was called skill NAR, which literally means a separation. For a man, the grounds for initiating a divorce were relatively broad. The most significant cause, as we've touched on, was a wife's inability to bear children. If after a reasonable amount of time, the law code suggests around 3 years, the union was barren, a man could legally dissolve a marriage to seek a more fertile partner. This was seen as a practical necessity for the continuation of his family line. He could also divorce his wife for what was considered a serious dereliction of her duties or a blow to his honor, if she mismanaged the household so badly that the family faced ruin. That could be grounds. If she was openly unfaithful, that was a massive dishonor and a clear reason to end the marriage. Interestingly, some law codes also mention that if a wife made clothes for her husband that were considered effeminate, like a shirt with such a low neckline it showed his nipples, this mockery of his masculinity was so severe that it could be grounds for divorce. It sounds trivial to us, but it struck at the heart of his public honor. But here's the crucial part. A divorce was not a simple dismissal. The financial contract had to be unwound. When a man divorced his wife, she was entitled to take her hymen FYLG, her dowry, back with her. Furthermore, if he was deemed to be the one at fault for the split, She was also entitled to the mandar, the bride price his family had paid to hers. This acted as a significant financial deterrent. A man wouldn't divorce his wife lightly, because it could be an incredibly expensive process. He would lose not only his domestic manager, but also a significant chunk of the family's wealth. This brings us to our odd detail for the chapter: the divorce on the doorstep. The procedure for declaring a divorce had to be public and formal. A man couldn't just tell his wife to leave. He had to declare his intention to divorce her in front of witnesses, first at their home, on the threshold of the longhouse. Then, he had to repeat the declaration at a public gathering, likely the local thing assembly. The declaration had to name a specific, legally valid reason. He had to state, "I am divorcing my wife because she has been unfaithful or because our union has produced no heir." He couldn't just say, "I don't like her anymore." The process was designed to be formal and to prevent impulsive decisions. Everything had to be done by the book. Now, the question of how these breaches of contract were proven is a fascinating area of academic discussion. How did you prove a wife was a bad manager? How did you prove infidelity in a world without DNA tests? This is where the sagas give us some clues, and where scholars debate their reliability. Accusations often relied on the testimony of witnesses, neighbors, servants, or family members who might have their own agendas. A thrall's testimony was generally not considered valid unless it was extracted under torture, a grim reality of their legal system. Often, disputes would come down to oaths. The accused party could swear a solemn oath of their innocence, often with the backing of a certain number of oath helpers, respected members of the community, who would swear that they believed the person's oath was true. It was a system built on reputation and public trust. If a woman of high standing and great honor swore she was innocent, her word carried immense weight. If a person with a poor reputation swore an oath, it might be worthless. Scholars are still trying to understand the mechanics of this legal system. Was it a genuine search for truth? Or was it more of a high-stakes popularity contest where the person with the most social capital won? As you navigate your life as a HUS freighter, you are constantly aware of this underlying contract. Your marriage is a partnership, but it's a conditional one. Your performance is being evaluated. If you fail to produce children, if you are accused of a serious transgression that shames your husband, the entire structure of your life could be dismantled. The keys could be taken away, the contract dissolved, and you could be sent back to your family's home. Your honor diminished. The stability of the longhouse was always underpinned by this cold, contractual reality. The alliance was strong, but it was not unbreakable. Use it by the fire, mending one of your husband's tunics. He comes in from the fields, angry about a dispute with a neighbor. HES in a foul mood, and he takes it out on you, shouting, his words sharp and cruel. Then, in his rage, he does something unthinkable. He strikes you, not a playful shove, but a hard, deliberate blow to the face. In that instant, the entire dynamic of your relationship, of your world, shifts. The contract has been breached, not by you, but by him. And in the Viking world, this gives you a power that is astonishing for the era, the power to say goodbye. One of the most surprising aspects of Norse law is that women could initiate divorce. This was exceptionally rare in most of Europe at the time. A woman was not her husband's property to be disposed of as he saw fit. She was a partner in a contract, and if he violated the terms of that contract, she had legal recourse. The grounds on which a woman could divorce her husband were quite specific and revealing. The most significant was physical abuse. If a husband struck his wife, the law was on her side. The sagas and law codes are clear on this. A man was not permitted to raise a hand to his wife. Some codes even specify that if he hit her 3 times, she had automatic grounds for divorce. This wasn't necessarily about a modern concept of protecting her from harm. It was about honor. For a husband to strike his wife was a dishonorable act. It showed a lack of self-control and was an abuse of his position as her legal guardian. It violated the dignity of her role as HUS Freja. Another major reason was his failure to provide. If a husband was so lazy, incompetent, or unlucky that he could not adequately feed and clothe his family, his wife could divorce him. The marriage was an economic partnership. If he wasn't holding up his end of the bargain as the provider, she had the right to dissolve the firm. This was a practical matter. A woman would not be legally tied to a man who was leading her and her children toward starvation. A third, and perhaps the most interesting, reason a woman could divorce her husband was for reasons of sexual dissatisfaction, though not in the way we might think. The law codes from Iceland state a woman could divorce her husband if he was unable to perform his marital duties. This wasn't about her pleasure, but about the primary purpose of the marriage: procreation. If he was impotent, he couldn't produce an heir, and the marriage contract was therefore unfulfilled. This leads to our quirky and very specific detail for this section. The law codes also mention that a woman could divorce her husband if he chose to wear clothing considered effeminate, the same charge that a man could use against his wife. If he wore a shirt with a plunging neckline or trousers that were cut in a style deemed unmanly, she could divorce him. Even more strangely, if a man decided to take up permanent residence and work in another country without his wife's permission, she could divorce him. The most cited reason, however, which ties into the theme of unmanly behavior, was if he had a wound that was so severe he could no longer function as a warrior or farmer, or if he couldn't satisfy her sexually. The sagas even tell stories of women divorcing men for being too soft or for being unable to consummate the marriage. A famous example is from Njal's saga, where a woman divorces her husband because he can't consummate the marriage, publicly shaming him. The procedure for a woman to declare divorce was the same as for a man. It had to be public and witnessed. She had to gather her own witnesses, go to the threshold of her home, and declare that she was divorcing her husband, stating the specific legal reason. I divorced my husband because he struck me in the presence of witnesses. She would then need to repeat this declaration at the local assembly. It was a bold, public act that would have required immense courage. She would be standing up to her husband and legal guardian in front of the entire community. This is where a point of scholarly debate arises. How often did this actually happen? The law codes say it was possible, and the sagas give us dramatic examples. But was it a common occurrence for an ordinary woman? Some scholars believe these saga accounts are exceptional stories, highlighting rare and scandalous events. They argue that the social pressure to stay married, the practical difficulties of uprooting one's life, and the potential for a violent reaction from a shamed husband would have made divorce a very risky and seldom-used option for women. Other scholars argue that we shouldn't underestimate the power this legal right gave women, even if it was rarely used. The threat of divorce was a powerful tool. A husband would know that if he abused his wife or failed to provide for her, she had a legal way out that would result in his public shame and a significant financial loss. As with a man divorcing his wife, the finances had to be settled. A woman who divorced her husband for a valid, legally recognized fault was entitled to walk away with her dowry and the bride price. This would have been a crippling blow to the husband's finances and his honor. Therefore, the mere existence of this law may have acted as a check on husband's behavior. So, you stand there, the sting of the slap still on your cheek. You are faced with a monumental choice. You can endure this, hoping it never happens again, and maintain the stability of your life. Or you can invoke your right. You can gather your witnesses. Walk to the door of this longhouse that has been your entire world, and speak the words that will undo it all. It would be an act of incredible bravery, a public declaration of your own worth and a refusal to accept a broken contract. The law says you can't. But in the smoky, crowded reality of the longhouse, surrounded by your husband's kin, it is a choice that could cost you everything, or win you back your freedom and your honor. Let's shift our focus away from the dynamics between men and women for a moment and look at the intense pressures that govern the lives of men. You are now a young Viking man, a carl, with a small farm and a growing reputation. You've proven yourself in a few local skirmishes and perhaps one short trading trip. Your honor is growing, but it's a fragile thing, constantly under scrutiny. And in this hyper-masculine world, the single most devastating accusation that can be leveled against you has nothing to do with your bravery in battle or your skill as a farmer. It's the charge of being unmanly. The concept was known as ERG in Old Norse story. RG are as an adjective. These words are difficult to translate directly. They encompass ideas of effemination, weakness, cowardice, and, most damningly, sexual passivity or receptiveness. To be called DRGR was the ultimate insult, a verbal weapon far more potent than calling someone a liar or a thief. It was a social death sentence. In the rigid gender roles of Viking society, masculinity was defined by action, aggression, and dominance. This applied to all spheres of life, from the battlefield to the bedroom. The ideal man was one who took what he wanted, who laid, who penetrated both literally and metaphorically. The concept of ERG was the absolute antithesis of this ideal. It implied that a man was passive, submissive, the one who was taken or used. This is why the insult was so deeply tied to accusations of homosexuality, but in a very specific way. The Vikings didn't seem to have a concept of sexual orientation as we do today. The issue wasn't whether a man had sex with another man. The critical, honor-destroying question was which role he took. A man who took the dominant, active role with another man might be seen as overly aggressive or strange, but his masculinity wasn't necessarily compromised. He was still acting the part of the penetrator. However, the man who took the passive or receptive role was seen as having abandoned his masculinity entirely. He was ARGR. He had willingly placed himself in the position of a woman or, even worse, a thrall. The consequences of such an accusation were catastrophic. A man accused of ERG, would lose all social and legal standing. His honor would be annihilated. He could be challenged to a duel, and if he refused to fight, it was seen as proof of the charge. According to some law codes, the accusation was so severe that it stripped a man of his legal rights. He could not act as a witness. He could not inherit property, and he could not be a legal guardian. He became a social outcast, a non-person. The shame was so profound that it could drive a man to violence or even suicide. This brings us to a strange and fascinating detail related to ERGI, its connection to magic. In the Norse world, most magic, known as seer, was considered women's work. The practice involved entering a trance state, divining the future, and manipulating fate, all acts that were seen as receptive and passive, requiring one to receive visions or be a vessel for spiritual forces. Therefore, any man who practiced seer was automatically considered DRGR. He was engaging in a female ardent, thus compromising his manhood. The great god Odin was the one major exception. Odin was the master of seer, the greatest of all magicians, but even he was not immune to the charge. In one of the myths, The trickster god Loki openly mocks Odin, calling him Aergior for practicing magic, dressing as a woman, and beating a drum like a witch. The fact that even the chief of the gods could be hit with this insult shows how powerful and pervasive it was. It was a fundamental contradiction in their cosmology. The most powerful god was also, in some sense, the most unmanly. The exact nature and application of ERG is a major topic of debate for historians. How much of the charge was about actual sexual practice, and how much of it was just a generic, but powerful, political smear? The sagas are full of characters flinging the accusation of ARG or ni in G are a related term for a vile, honorless person at their enemies. It was often used to provoke an opponent into a fight. If you wanted to legally kill a rival, you could publicly insult him in this manner. He would be honor-bound to challenge you to a duel, a home game. If you won the duel, you were not only victorious, but had also legally proven his lack of honor. Some scholars argue that the accusations were rarely about literal sexual acts and were almost entirely a form of ritualized slander, a tool in the constant competition for honor. Others maintain that while it was certainly used as a political weapon, the fear and stigma were rooted in a very real and deep-seated anxiety about gender roles and sexual propriety. They point to the severity of the legal consequences as evidence that this was more than just name-calling. It was a fundamental social taboo. As a man in this world, you would live in constant awareness of this invisible line. You had to project strength, confidence, and dominance at all times. A moment of perceived weakness, a rumor, a poorly chosen word could be twisted into this fatal accusation. Your masculinity was not an inherent quality. It was a performance, and you were always on stage. The fear of being seen as ARG would govern how you dressed, how you spoke, how you fought, and how you conducted every aspect of your life. It was the ultimate nightmare, a shadow that haunted the male psyche in the Viking Age. The tension in the longhouse is thick enough to cut with a knife. It's been simmering for weeks. You, the young farmer, are in a dispute with your neighbor over a piece of pastureland that lies between your farms. It's a classic conflict, the kind that can easily fester and poison a community. The local thing has failed to resolve it. One evening, at a feast, your neighbor, flushed with alien bravado, decides to escalate things. He doesn't challenge you to a fight over the land. He chooses a more vicious weapon. He stands up, and in front of everyone, he directs a verse of scornful poetry at you. I mean, and in this poem, he doesn't just call you a poor farmer. He implies that you are ARGR. The longhouse falls silent. The crackle of the fire is the only sound. Every eye is on you. This is a moment of truth, a critical juncture from which there is no peaceful retreat. Your neighbor has just thrown down the most severe gauntlet possible. He has publicly attacked your honor and your very identity as a man. To let this insult stand would be to accept it. Your reputation would be destroyed. Your wife might have grounds to divorce you, and you would become a social outcast. You have only one option: violence. This is how countless blood feuds began, not with a physical blow, but with a verbal one, an insult, particularly one that questioned a man's masculinity, demanded a response. The most formal and legally recognized response was the home gang, a ritualized duel. The home gang was a fascinating institution, part legal proceeding, part single combat. It was a way to settle disputes that couldn't be resolved through normal legal channels, and it operated on the principle that the gods would grant victory to the person who was in the right. If you were challenged to a home game, or if you were the one issuing the challenge, you could not refuse. To refuse was an admission of guilt and cowardice, making you an outlaw. Ani and GR. The duel had a specific set of rules, though they varied by time and place. A designated area would be marked out, often on a small island or islet de home, hence the name, so that neither combatant could easily flee. The ground might be marked with stones or covered with a cloak. The combatants would stand in this designated area and fight. They were usually allowed a certain number of shields. If your shield was broken, you could be given a replacement, up to a set limit. The fight would continue until one person was wounded, killed, or stepped outside the designated fighting area. The winner of the duel not only won the argument, be it over land, a dirt, or an insult, but was also often entitled to a payment in silver from the loser. It was a high-stakes legal battle fought with axes and swords instead of words. This is where we find a very peculiar detail about the laws of insult. The Vikings had a sophisticated legal concept of slander called fullredisor, or words of full penalty. These were 3 specific accusations that were so severe that they automatically gave the insulted party the right to kill the slanderer without facing a murder charge, provided he did so immediately and publicly. The first was accusing a man of being a sorcerer or ARGR. The second was accusing him of being responsible for a supernatural disaster, like causing a landslide through magic. The third was comparing him to an animal in a demeaning sexual way, for example, implying he was a mare or a she-wolf. If someone leveled one of these insults at you, you could legally draw your weapon and strike them down on the spot. It was considered a justifiable homicide, a defense of one's honor. The historical reality of the home gang and killings over insults is a topic of intense debate among scholars. The sagas are filled with dramatic duels and bloody revenge killings sparked by a single cutting remark. They are the narrative engine of many of these stories. But how common were they in real life? Some historians argue that the sagas, being heroic literature, likely exaggerate the frequency and scale of such violence. They suggest that communities would have had strong social pressures to mediate disputes and prevent them from escalating to bloodshed, which could be incredibly destructive and lead to spiraling, multi-generational feuds. Other scholars argue that we should take the sagas more seriously as a reflection of the central role of honor in the society. They contend that while a full-blown home gang might have been a last resort, the threat of violence was always present. The legal codes support this, with their detailed rules about dueling and justifiable homicide. The violence may not have been an everyday occurrence, but the potential for violence shaped every social interaction. It was the ultimate enforcement mechanism for the code of honor. A man had to constantly consider whether his words or actions might provoke a violent response. Back in the longhouse, the silence stretches on. Your neighbor's smirk is a mask of challenge. Your heart is pounding in your chest. You are not a killer. You are a farmer. But in this moment, your identity as a farmer is irrelevant. You are a man whose honor has been publicly destroyed. You slowly get to your feet, your hand instinctively going to the hilt of the small axe at your belt, the utility tool you use every day. But now, it's no longer a tool. It's the instrument by which you must reclaim your name. You issue the challenge. Your voice heightens strain. I challenge you to home gang at the island by the 3 stones. 3 nights from now. The words are out. The legal machinery is in motion. There is no turning back. A dispute over a few feet of grass has, with a handful of poisonous words, escalated into a matter of life and death. This was the brutal calculus of honor in the Viking Age. Let's turn our attention back to the silent figures who move in the shadows of the longhouse. The ones who own nothing, not even themselves. The thralls. We've established their place at the absolute bottom of the social ladder. But how did a person end up there? The paths to slavery in the Viking world were numerous, and each one was a story of catastrophe. Imagine you are a young boy living in a small coastal village in Ireland. Life is simple, predictable. One morning, the cry goes up. Long ships. Before your village can mount a defense, the raiders are upon you. They are a terrifying storm of violence and chaos. They kill the men who resist, seize anything of value, livestock, tools, religious artifacts, and round up the women and children. You are kicked, bound, and thrown into the bottom of one of their dragon pro-wed ships. This was the most common and notorious method of enslavement. Capture in a raid. The Vikings were not just warriors. They were Europe's most prolific and far-reaching slave traders. Their voyages of discovery and plunder were, at their core, massive slaving expeditions. They depopulated entire coastal regions of Ireland, England, and France, funneling captives into a vast network that stretched from Dublin to Kiev and all the way to Constantinople in the Middle East. Or, imagine you are a farmer in a neighboring Norse settlement. A feud between your chieftain and another has escalated into open warfare. Your side loses. In the aftermath, the victorious Jarl claims you and your entire family as spoils of war. Your farm is seized, and you, once a free Carl, are now the thrall of your former rival. War among Scandinavians was another significant source of slaves. Perhaps your story is less dramatic, but no less tragic. You are a Carl, a free farmer, but a series of unlucky events has pushed you to the brink. A blight destroyed your crops. Your best cow died, and your boat was smashed in a storm. You fall into debt with a wealthier neighbor. The debt grows, and you have no way to pay it. The law was clear. If you could not settle your debts, your creditor could seize your property. If that wasn't enough, he could seize you and your family. You are forced to sell yourself, your wife, and your children into servitude to cover what you owe. This debt slavery was a constant threat hanging over the heads of poor Carls. A single stroke of bad luck could send a free family tumbling down into the abyss of thralldom. And finally, the most hopeless path. You could simply be born a thrall. If your mother was a slave, you were born a slave. Your owner was not your mother's master, but your mother's master's master. You were the property of your owner from your first breath. Your entire life would be one of servitude, with little to no hope of ever tasting freedom. Once enslaved, your life became one of unceasing labor. You would perform the most grueling, back-breaking tasks. You would quarry stone, dig ditches, fell trees, and row the massive long ships on their voyages. Female thralls would grind endless bushels of grain on heavy stone querns, a task so punishing it would wear down their teeth from the grit in their joints from the repetitive motion. They did the dirtiest domestic chores, cleaning, carrying water, mucking out the animal stalls, and serving the free members of the household. This brings us to a peculiar and sad detail: the naming of thralls. A slave was stripped of their original name, their last link to their former identity. They were given new, simple, and often derogatory names by their masters. Archaeological and written evidence shows a pattern of thrall names that were deliberately insulting. Male thralls were often given names like our LL literally thrall, or a snee donkey. Female thralls were given names like Wyarnathorn, Drumbiela, or D. IJ do girl. These names were a constant, daily reminder of their subhuman status. They were not just names. They were labels, brands. The question of social mobility for thralls is a contentious one among historians. As we touched on before, the law codes do mention the possibility of a thrall buying their freedom lace in GI. But how realistic was this? The debate is fierce. Some scholars believe that manumission might have been relatively common, especially for skilled thralls or for women who had children with their masters. They see as a way for masters to reward loyalty or to relieve themselves of the burden of caring for elderly slaves. Other historians are far more pessimistic. They argue that the concept of a thrall earning money is almost nonsensical. What time or resources would they have? Any craft they produced or extra work they did technically belonged to their master anyway. They argue that freedom was an almost impossible dream for the vast majority of thralls. They point to burials as evidence. The stark difference between the well-furnished graves of carls and the unceremonious burials of thralls suggests a society with a virtually uncrossable chasm between the free and the unfree. The lace in GEI status, they argue, was likely rare and still carried a heavy social stigma. So you are now a thrall. Your name is called. Your family is scattered or enslaved alongside you. You have no rights, no honor, no legal standing. You are an object, a tool, a piece of livestock with hands. You sleep on the cold floor of the longhouse. You eat the scraps left over from the family's meal. And you work from before the sun rises until long after it sets. Your life is a relentless cycle of hard labor and humiliation. But the physical hardship is only part of your nightmare. The most terrifying aspect of your existence is the absolute lack of control you have over your own body. You are a thrall. Let's be more specific. You are a young woman, captured in a raid on a foreign shore and brought back to this cold, smoky longhouse. You've been given a new, demeaning name. You perform the most thankless labor from dawn to dusk. But the physical exhaustion is a dull, constant take compared to the sharp, ever-present fear that defines your existence. This fear stems from a simple, brutal fact of your new reality. Your body is not your own. For a thrall, particularly a female thrall, the concept of bodily autonomy did not exist. You were property. Your master, the head of the household, had absolute sexual access to you. This was not a gray area. It was an accepted and understood right of ownership. He could use your body whenever and however he wished. There was no concept of rape within this context because, in the eyes of the law and society, you were not a person who could be violated. You were an object that could be used. Imagine the constant, grinding terror of this situation. Every moment of the day, you are under the eye of your master. A glance from him could signal his intent. There is no one you can appeal to. The S3X, his wife, might see you as a rival or a threat, and her anger would be directed at you, not him. The other free members of the household would see it as their chieftain simply exercising his rights. The other thralls are powerless to help you. They live under the same threat. There is no escape, no protection. This reality is the darkest aspect of Viking sexuality, one that is often glossed over in popular portrayals that focus on strong-shield maidens and egalitarian partnerships. The entire system of honor, lure, and family that protected a free woman like the S3X was completely absent for a thrall. The S3X was protected from unwanted advances. An assault on her was an assault on her husband's honor. An assault on you, the thrall, was meaningless because you had no honor to defend. The sagas, while they don't often dwell on the explicit details, are rife with casual references to this reality. A chieftain might have children with his wife and with several of his female thralls simultaneously. It's mentioned as a simple statement of fact, like listing his other possessions. For example, the Laxdla saga features a powerful Icelandic chieftain, her skald, who buys a beautiful but mute thrall woman named Melkorka in Norway. He takes her as his concubine, and she bears him a son. It is only later revealed that she is actually an Irish princess who was captured and pretended to be mute to hide her noble origins. Her story has a happy ending of sorts when her son grows up to be a great hero. But the premise of the story, a wealthy man buying a woman for the express purpose of sexual servitude, is presented as completely normal. This leads us to a grim and chilling little detail: the group exploitation of captives. When Vikings captured women in a raid, the sagas and other accounts suggest that these women were sometimes treated as communal property by the ship's crew on the voyage home, before they were brought to market or divided up as individual property. The 10th century Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who encountered a group of Rus Vikings on the Volga River, wrote a famous and controversial account of their behavior. He described them as having constant, public sexual relations with their slave girls in front of their comrades. While Ibn Fadlan's account is likely colored by his own cultural biases and shock, it points to a mindset where enslaved women were seen as objects for the gratification of the warrior group. The academic debate around this topic is, understandably, a sensitive one. The central question is about the emotional and social reality behind the brutal legal framework. Did all masters exercise this right? Were there masters who were kind and left their thralls alone? Almost certainly, yes. Human behavior is a spectrum, but the point is that it was his choice, not hers. Any kindness was a privilege he granted, not a right she possessed. Some scholars have tried to find hints of resistance or agency in the thrall stories. They point to figures like the aforementioned Melkorka, who used her wits to protect her identity and secure a better future for her son. They suggest that female thralls might have tried to use their position to gain favor, to secure better treatment for themselves or their children. This is plausible, but it's a form of agency born of utter desperation. It's the agency of trying to find the most comfortable position within an iron cage. Other historians caution against trying to romanticize or find empowerment in this situation. They argue that we must confront the stark reality of the sources. Viking society was built on a system that institutionalized the sexual exploitation of a significant portion of its population. The freedom, power, and honor of the elite, both male and female, were directly subsidized by the complete and total subjugation of the thralls. So, you live your life in this state of constant vulnerability. You learn to make yourself small, to be invisible. You try to anticipate your master's moods. You watch his wife, the H.U.S. Freja, with a mixture of fear and envy. She is a woman, like you, but her body is protected by a fortress of laws, honor, and social standing. Your body has no such walls. It is an open territory, and you are merely its unwilling inhabitant. This is the deepest, darkest truth of the Viking Age. You are the female thrall we've been following. You have survived, day by day, under the constant threat of your master's whims. And then, the inevitable happens. You find yourself pregnant. The child you carry is your master's. This new life, growing inside you, does not bring joy or hope. It brings a new, terrifying layer of complexity and uncertainty to your already precarious existence. The fate of children born from the union of a master and a thrall was one of the most ambiguous and fraught issues in Norse society. These children were born into a legal and social chasm. They were not free, but they were not exactly thralls in the same way their mother was. They were the master's own flesh and blood, a fact that could be both a blessing and a curse. When the child is born, there is no ceremony. There is no father proudly placing the infant on his knee, sprinkling it with water, and welcoming it into the family. The child's legal status was, by default, the same as its mother's. A thrall. It was born into servitude. It was the property of the mother's owner. This was a cold, hard baseline. However, the reality on the ground was often more nuanced. A master's feelings towards his child by a thrall could vary wildly. He might feel a flicker of paternal affection or responsibility. He might see the child as just another piece of property, or he might see it as an inconvenience, a reminder of a casual transgression. The child's entire life would be shaped by the whims of this one man. If the master felt some attachment to the child, he might grant it and its mother slightly better treatment. They might receive better food, warmer clothes, or less strenuous work. The child, growing up in the longhouse, would exist in a strange limbo. They were the son or daughter of the powerful man in the high seat, yet they were expected to serve their own half-siblings, the legitimate children of the HUS Freja. It was a recipe for a lifetime of resentment and social awkwardness. This brings us to our very specific and rather poignant legal detail for this chapter: the gift of freedom. A father had the legal right to free his child by a thrall. This was not an automatic process. It required a formal, public act of manumission. He could also choose to free the mother at the same time. This was often the best-case scenario for a thrall mother, that her child might inspire the master to grant them both their freedom. However, even a freed child, always in GR, was not on equal footing with a freeborn child. They would still carry the social stigma of their mother's servitude, and their legal rights might be curtailed. The most dramatic step a father could take, as we've touched upon, was to formally adopt his thrall-born son and make him his legal heir. This was typically a last resort, done only if the master had no legitimate sons with his legal wife. This process, called T-Laying, required a public ceremony at the thing. The father would essentially declare the boy to be his full and legal son, granting him all the rights of inheritance. This would have been an incredibly tense event. It would elevate a slave child to the highest position, angering the father's extended family, who might have seen themselves as the rightful heirs. It would also be a source of profound humiliation for the legal wife, the HUS Freja, a public testament to her failure to produce a male heir. The historical and archaeological evidence for the status of these children is a subject of ongoing debate. Genetic studies of ancient Icelandic remains have shown a fascinating pattern. A significant portion of the founding female population had Gaelic, Irish, and Scottish DNA, while the founding male population was overwhelmingly Norse. This provides stark genetic proof of the Viking practice of raiding the British Isles for women, who were then brought back to places like Iceland as wives, concubines, or thralls. This means that a large number of the first generation of Icelanders were the children of Norse fathers and non-Norse, often enslaved mothers. Scholars debate how this dynamic played out in the developing society. Did the stigma of a thrall mother fade after a generation or two, or did it create a permanent underclass? The sagas, written several centuries later, tend to romanticize this history. They are filled with heroes who are the sons or grandsons of captive princesses like Melkor K's son, Olaf the Peacock. These stories might be a way of laundering a less glamorous history, turning a story of brutal sexual exploitation into a tale of exotic, high-status ancestors. The reality for the average child of a master and a thrall was likely far less heroic. For you, the thrall mother, your child's birth is the beginning of a long, desperate campaign. You must do everything in your power to make your child appeal to its father, your master. You hope he sees a glimmer of himself in the child's eyes. You pray the child is strong and clever. Every small sign of paternal interest is a victory. Your own fate is now inextricably linked to this child. The child is your only potential leverage, your only possible path to a life of dignity. But it's a terrifying gamble. If the master shows no interest, or if the child is sickly, you and your baby could be sold off together. Or worse, separated forever. You rock your child in the shadows of the longhouse, knowing that its future, and your own, rests entirely in the hands of a man you are forced to call master. The Lord. Dark winter is finally over. The ice is breaking up in the fjord, and a restless energy fills the longhouse. The men are checking the rigging on the long ships, patching the sails, and sharpening their axes. The air buzzes with talk of far-off lands, England, Francia, the rivers of the east. This is the season of the raid. For the free men, the cows and Jarls, this is a time of opportunity, a chance to win wealth, glory, and honor. But what is the true purpose of this voyage? What are they really seeking? From our modern perspective, shaped by movies and television, we tend to think of a Viking raid as a smash-and-grab operation for gold and silver. And that was certainly a major part of it. A successful raid on a wealthy, poorly defended monastery could yield a fortune in precious metals, which could then be used to reward followers, buy land, and display status. But hoarding treasure was not the primary economic engine of the Viking Age. The most valuable commodity they sought, the one that truly fueled their expansion and their economy, was human. The primary purpose of most raids was to acquire thralls. You are now a young Carl, setting out on your first major voyage. The excitement is immense, but so is the fear. You huddle in the open, clinker-built long ship, spray soaking you to the bone. The ship is a marvel of engineering, fast, flexible, and with a shallow draft that allows it to travel far up rivers, striking deep into enemy territory where no one expects an attack. After days or weeks at sea, you spot your target, a small, prosperous-looking settlement on the coast. Your chieftain gives the order. You and the other men grab your round shields and axes and leap into the shallow water, roaring your battle cries. The goal is to create maximum shock and terror. You overwhelm the local defenses through speed and ferocity. But once the initial resistance is broken, the nature of the operation changes. It's not about mindless destruction. It's about asset acquisition. You don't burn all the buildings. You need to see what's inside. You don't kill everyone. That would be destroying the most valuable loot. The able-bodied men who fought back are likely killed. But to win it, the children, and the young men who surrendered or were unable to fight, they are the prize. They are rounded up, their hands bound. Their cries and pleas are just noise in the background of your work. You are not thinking of them as people. You are thinking of them as farmien or trade goods. This is where a strange and pragmatic detail of raiding comes into play. Selective looting. Experienced traders knew what was valuable and portable. They would, of course, take gold and silver chalices, jewelry, and coins, but they would also take functional, high-value items, fine cloth, like embroidered vestments from a church, was highly prized. Quality weapons and tools were also taken, but the most important task was to secure the human cargo. You would assess the captives as you would livestock. Are they strong, healthy, young? These factors determine their market price. The role of thralls in the Viking economy is a subject that historians have increasingly focused on in recent decades. For a long time, the focus was on the Vikings as explorers, traders, and warriors. But scholars like Anders Winroth have forcefully argued that we must see the Viking Age as, fundamentally, a slave-based economy. The debate centers on the scale and importance of this trade. Some argue that while slavery was present, it was just one part of a complex economy that also included farming, fishing, and legitimate trade in goods like furs and amber. Others contend that the slave trade was the absolute core of the Viking world's economic power. They argue that the vast wealth needed to build fleets, support warrior class, and establish new settlements like those in Iceland and Normandy simply could not have been generated by farming and small-scale trade alone. It required the massive infusion of capital and labor that only a large-scale slave economy could provide. The thralls weren't just a byproduct of raiding. They were the entire point. They were brought back to Scandinavia to work the farms, allowing more free men to go on raids, and they were sold in the great slave markets of Europe and the East, generating the hard currency that financed the whole enterprise. As the raid winds down, you and your comrades load the plunder onto the longship. The human captives are shoved into the hold, packed tightly together in the dark. Their journey into slavery has begun. You feel a surge of pride and accomplishment. You have survived your first battle. You have won your share of the loot, which will be divided up by the chieftain according to each man's contribution and status. You have proven your worth as a Viking. You look at the burning remnants of the village, at the weeping captives being herded onto your ship. You might feel a pang of something pity, perhaps, but you push it down. This is the way of the world. Strength triumphs over weakness. Your people are strong, and these people were weak. The sagas you grew up hearing are filled with tales of such victories. This is what it means to be a man, to build your honor and your wealth. You don't see yourself as a monster or a villain. You see yourself as a successful entrepreneur in the only business that truly matters. The raid was a success, not because of the few bags of silver you acquired, but because of the terrified, huddled human cargo in the belly of your ship. The raid is over. The longship, now sitting lower in the water, heavy with plunder and people, pushes off from the burning shore. For the victorious raiders, there is a sense of grim satisfaction. But for the captives huddled in the bilge, the true horror is just beginning. What happened in the immediate aftermath of a successful raid? And how was sexual violence used as a tool of conquest? This is perhaps the most difficult and disturbing aspect of the Viking Age to confront, but it is essential to understanding the full picture. Let's be very clear. Rape was not just an unfortunate byproduct of the chaos of war. It was often a deliberate and strategic part of the conquest itself. It served several brutal, practical purposes. First and foremost, it was an ultimate expression of dominance. In a world obsessed with honor and social standing, the ability to violate the women of a conquered people was a powerful and visceral way of demonstrating their complete subjugation. It was a message sent to the defeated men. We are so much stronger than you that we can take your wives, sisters, and daughters. We have destroyed your honor and your lineage. Second, it was a tool of terror. The widespread and public violation of women sent a shockwave of fear through a region. It was a warning to other settlements. This is what will happen to you if you resist us. This psychological warfare could make future conquests easier, as communities might choose to surrender or pay tribute rather than face a similar fate. Third, from the raiders' cold, pragmatic viewpoint, it was a way of testing the merchandise. Captive women were a primary form of loot, destined to become thralls or concubines. Their fertility was a key component of their value. Forcing pregnancy upon them was a way to create the next generation of slaves. You are now one of the captives, a young woman from a small Anglo-Saxon village. Your world has been shattered in a matter of hours. You are crammed into the dark, foul-smelling belly of the ship with dozens of others. The sounds are a symphony of misery. The weeping of children, the groans of the wounded, the rough shouts of your captors in their alien tongue. Above you, on the deck, the Vikings are celebrating their victory, drinking the ale they looted from your village. The fear you feel is absolute. You know what is coming. The sagas and chronicles from the victims' perspectives, like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, are often circumspect, but the message is clear. They speak of the Vikings defiling women and ravaging communities. The implication is unmistakable. During the long, terrifying voyage back to Scandinavia, you and the other female captives would be at the complete mercy of the crew. As we've noted, accounts like Ibn Fadlan suggest that this abuse could be casual, open, and communal. You are no longer a person. You are part of the spoils, to be divided and used like the rest of the plunder. This brings us to a grim and specific detail: the concept of war brides as a form of justification. In the sagas, which were written from the Viking perspective, this brutal reality is often sanitized or even romanticized. A story might describe a hero who takes a beautiful captive woman as his prize, and she later becomes his beloved wife or the mother of his famous children. This narrative framing serves to legitimize the act of abduction and rape. It transforms an act of violent conquest into the beginning of a fated love story. It's a form of historical propaganda, smoothing over the brutal reality of sexual slavery by presenting it as a spoil of war that a warrior is entitled to. The extent to which sexual violence was a standard operating procedure is a subject of academic debate, largely due to the nature of the sources. The victims' accounts, like those from Christian monks, are often filled with righteous fury and may use exaggerated rhetoric to paint the pagan Vikings as demonic monsters. The Vikings' own accounts, the sagas, were written centuries later and had their own agenda, often downplaying or reframing the most brutal aspects of their ancestors' behavior. Some historians argue that while sexual violence certainly occurred, we should be cautious about assuming it was a universal policy in every raid. The primary goal was to take healthy captives to sell or use as labor. Widespread violence could injure or traumatize the product, potentially diminishing its value. They suggest that a pragmatic chieftain might have restrained his men to protect his assets. Other scholars argue this view is too sanitized. They contend that the logic of honor, dominance, and terror made sexual violence an integral part of the Viking raiding model. They point to the genetic evidence from places like Iceland as proof that the systematic abduction and impregnation of foreign women was a core element of their expansion. They argue that seeing captives as assets doesn't preclude sexual violence. In a slave-based system, the owner has the right to use their property as they see fit, and this extended to the bodies of the enslaved. For you, the captive on the ship, these academic distinctions are meaningless. Your reality is one of absolute powerlessness. The honor codes that protected a free Norse woman are a world away. The laws that governed her marriage contract, her property, and her safety are irrelevant to you. You are caught in a legal and moral void. The men who captured you see you not as a person, but as an object that signifies their victory. The violence inflicted upon you is not personal. It's a statement of power, a seal on their conquest, and the horrifying first chapter of your new life as a thrall. The seemingly endless voyage is over. The long ship glides into a familiar-looking fjord. But this is not your home. This is the heartland of your captors. The air is colder. The mountains are steeper. The language is a harsh guttural music you are beginning to understand through commands and curses. You and the other surviving captives are prodded off the ship and onto solid ground. You are weak, filthy, and traumatized. But your ordeal is far from over. No, you must be processed and integrated into the Viking economy. The first thing that happens is the division of the spoils. The chieftain of the raid, the jarl, stands before his crew. The loot, the silver, the weapons, the cloth, and the people is laid out. The chieftain takes the largest share for himself, as is his right for organizing and leading the expedition. Then, the rest of the plunder is divided among the free men of the crew. Each man's share is determined by his status and his performance during the raid. A proven, veteran warrior gets a larger share than a young man on his first voyage. You are made to stand with the other captives as the warriors walk among you, assessing you like livestock at a market. One of the raiders, the Carl whose perspective we followed earlier, points at you. You have been assigned as part of his share. He might have also received a few silver coins and a new axe, but you are his most significant prize. You are now his property. What happens next depends on his intentions and his status. If he is a wealthy man with a large farm, he might take you back to his longhouse to become a new domestic thrall, joining the others in their life of servitude. You will be put to work under the watchful, and likely resentful, eye of his wife, the HUS Freja. Alternatively, he might decide to sell you. Major trading hubs like he did by in Denmark, Berke in Sweden, or Dublin in Ireland were thriving centers of commerce, and one of the most lucrative commodities traded was human beings. Your new owner might take you to one of these towns. There, you would be put on display in a slave market, poked and prodded by potential buyers from as far away as the Byzantine Empire or the Abbasid Caliphate. Your fate would be determined by the highest bidder. You could end up on a farm just a few valleys over, or you could be shipped across the known world, never to see a familiar landscape again. This brings us to a specific and haunting detail: the family unit's destruction. The Vikings had little to no regard for preserving the family ties of their captives. A mother might be sold to one buyer, her child to another. A husband and wife would be separated without a second thought. This wasn't necessarily out of active malice. It was just business. They were maximizing their profit by selling each unit to the buyer who wanted it most. For the captives, this was a final, devastating act of cruelty, the severing of the last connection to their old lives. The integration of these foreign thralls into Norse society is the subject of ongoing archaeological and historical research. How did this massive influx of foreign people change the culture? The evidence is often subtle. Archaeologists have found new types of pottery or weaving techniques of Scandinavian sites that seem to have been introduced from the British Isles, suggesting that captive women were bringing their own cultural knowledge with them. Grave goods can also offer clues. A woman buried in a Scandinavian-style grave, but with a distinctively Irish or Slavic brooch, might be a first-generation thrall, buried by a master who allowed her to keep a single personal possession. The linguistic evidence is also debated. Did the thralls create a Pidgin or Creole language to communicate with their masters? Did their native tongues influence the development of Old Norse in any significant way? Some scholars argue that the influence was minimal, as thralls would have been forced to learn Norse to survive and their own languages would have been suppressed. Others believe that a society with such a large enslaved population must have had a more complex linguistic landscape, with bilingualism and code switching being common. It's a difficult question to answer, as the voices of the thralls themselves were never recorded. For you, the new thrall, your new life begins now. You are given a new name, a coarse wool tunic, and a list of chores that will fill every waking moment. You must learn a new language, new customs, and a new set of fears. You live in the longhouse, but you are not part of the family. You are part of the infrastructure. Your primary value is your labor. You grind the grain. You carry the water. You muck out the stalls. And the sexual exploitation that began on the ship does not end. Your new owner has the same rights over your body as the chieftain did. You are his to use as he pleases. Your presence creates a new and volatile dynamic in his household. His wife may see you as a threat to her position and her marriage. She may treat you with extreme cruelty, a way of asserting her dominance and venting her frustration. You are caught between the master's power and the mistress's resentment, a powerless pawn in their domestic politics. You look around the smoky longhouse, at the faces of the free family eating their meal around the fire. This is your world now. Your old life. Your family. Your name, they are ghosts. Memories that you must learn to suppress in order to survive. You have been violently uprooted and transplanted into the very bottom of a harsh, alien society. Your journey of conquest is over, but your life of subjugation has just begun. Not all interactions between Vikings and foreigners were violent conquests. The Vikings were not only raiders, they were also the greatest traders of their age. Their long ships, which brought terror to coastal villages, also carried valuable goods to bustling trade emporiums that dotted the coasts of Europe and the rivers of the East. In these cosmopolitan melting pots, the rules of engagement were different. Here, we see a different, more complex kind of relationship unfold. The cross-cultural encounter based on commerce rather than conquest. Imagine you are a Viking merchant, a Carl who has decided that trading furs offers a better risk-to-reward ratio than reading monasteries. You steer your ship, the wider, deeper vessel called an air designed for cargo, not combat, into a thriving port like Dubai, Burka, or even further afield to a Slavic settlement like Kiev. The moment you step ashore, you are in a different world. The air is a babel of languages. Old Norse, Old Slavonic, Arabic, Greek. The market is a kaleidoscope of goods you would never see at home. Shimmering silks from the East, fine glassware from the Rhineland, intricate silver jewelry from the Caliphate, and fragrant spices that have traveled thousands of miles. You are here to trade the bounty of the North Wall ivory, timber, thick furs, and, of course, a few thralls you acquired on a previous expedition. In these multicultural boomtowns, relationships were more fluid and pragmatic. A Viking merchant might spend months or even years living abroad, waiting for the right trading season or for a convoy to form. During this time, it was common for them to form temporary or long-term relationships with local women. These unions were not the formal, contract-heavy marriages we saw back in the Scandinavian longhouse. They were alliances of convenience, companionship, and mutual benefit. A local woman, perhaps a Slavic artisan, or the daughter of a local merchant, might see a partnership with a wealthy Viking trader as an opportunity. He had access to exotic goods and silver. She had local knowledge, language skills, and connections that could help him navigate the complex social and commercial landscape. Their relationship would be a symbiotic one. She would be his local agent, translator, and companion. In return, she and her family would gain access to his wealth and the prestige that came with associating with a successful foreign merchant. This is where we find a fascinating detail about these relationships. The trade wife. This wasn't a formal legal term, but it describes the practical reality. These were not frill concubines in the Norse sense, nor were they legal wives bound by a mandarindari. They were partners in a specific context. When the Viking trader was in town, they lived as husband and wife. But it was often understood that when his business was concluded and he sailed for home, the relationship might end. He would return to his legal HUS Freja and his ancestral farm in Norway or Sweden. What happened to the women and any children from these unions? This is where the historical record gets murky and is a subject of much debate. In some cases, the Viking trader might take his 4 unwifen children back to Scandinavia with him. If he did, the woman would occupy a status somewhere between a high-status concubine and a legal wife, and the children's legitimacy would be a complex issue for his family at home to deal with. More often, it seems, the woman and her children were left behind. The trader might provide for them generously, leaving them with a parting gift of silver or property that would secure their future. The children would be raised within their mother's culture, carrying the legacy of their powerful foreign father. Sagas and historical chronicles, like the Russian Primary Chronicle, hint at this. The very foundation of the Rus state in Kiev is attributed to Viking chieftains who integrated with the local Slavic population, with their descendants becoming the ruling class. This suggests that the children of these unions were often not just accepted, but could rise to positions of great power. Scholars are divided on how to interpret these relationships. Were they examples of early multiculturalism and female agency, where local women made pragmatic choices to improve their social and economic standing? Or were they just a different flavor of exploitation, where powerful foreign men used their wealth to secure temporary, domestic and sexual partners, whom they could abandon when it was convenient? The truth is likely a messy combination of both. Some of these unions were probably genuine partnerships, built on mutual respect and affection. Others were likely purely transactional. The power dynamic was always skewed in favor of the wealthy foreign merchant. However, compared to the fate of a woman captured in a raid, the trade wife had a far greater degree of agency and a much better chance of securing a prosperous future for herself and her children. So, you, the Viking merchant, have spent a year in Kiev. Your Slavic partner has been invaluable. She has helped you navigate the treacherous local politics and has managed your household, allowing you to focus on your trade. You have a son together, but now the ice is thawing, and the call of home of your real farm and your real wife is strong. You make your decision. You will leave a substantial amount of your profit, a bag of silver, a roll of silk, with your Slavic partner. It's enough to ensure she and your son will live in comfort. You share a quiet, final meal with her. There may be sadness, but there is also a sense of a contract fulfilled. The next day, you board your Nair and set sail for the north. You have closed a successful business deal, in more ways than one. Let's pull back from the world of human transactions, the marriages, the raids, the trade deals, and look up towards the gods. The Vikings lived in a world that was intensely spiritual, populated by a host of powerful and often unpredictable deities. Their beliefs about these gods had a profound impact on how they viewed the most fundamental aspects of life: fertility, sex, and birth. This wasn't a separate, religious sphere. It was woven into the very fabric of their daily existence. At the heart of their beliefs about fertility were 2 of the most popular and beloved deities in the Norse pantheon, the twins Freyr and Freyja. They were not of the main tribe of gods, the Ser like Odin and Thor. They belonged to a second group, the Vanir, who were associated with the earth, the sea, nature, and prosperity. The story goes that the 2 tribes of gods fought a great war, which ended in a truce and an exchange of hostages. Freyr and Freyja came to live in Asgard, the home of the Ser, and they brought their unique powers with them. Freyr was the god of peace, sunshine, and, most importantly, virility and good harvest. His primary symbol was his magnificent golden boar, Gullinborstai, which represented fertility and the bounty of the earth. Farmers would pray to Freyr for a plentiful crop and for the health of their livestock, but he was also invoked for human fertility. His most prominent feature in mythological descriptions and artistic depictions is an erect phallus. Small phallic amulets and statues, found by archaeologists, are widely believed to be representations of Freyr, worn or placed in the home to encourage conception and male potency. He represented the active, generative masculine force of nature. His twin sister, Freyja, was arguably the most powerful and complex goddess in the pantheon. She was the goddess of love, purity, desire, and sexuality. But she was also a goddess of war, death, and magic seer. She was said to ride in a chariot pulled by two cats and to own a magnificent necklace, the Be-Rising Amen, which was a symbol of her alluring power. Freyja was no demure goddess of romance. She was the embodiment of female sexual agency. The myths portray her as taking many lovers, both gods and mortals, according to her own desires. She was not shamed for this. It was simply part of her nature. She represented a powerful, untamed female sexuality that was both life-giving and dangerous. This brings us to a strange and controversial detail: the possibility of ritualized sex or sacred prostitution in Viking Age Scandinavia. The primary evidence for this comes from later, often hostile, Christian sources and from the writings of Adam of Bremen, an 11th century German chronicler. He described the great pagan temple at Uppsala in Sweden, a major religious center. He claimed that during the great festivals held there every 9 years, sacrifices of both animals and humans were made to Odin, Thor, and Fricco, his Latinized name for Freyr. Regarding Freyr, Adam of Bremen wrote that the sacrifices to him were accompanied by unseemly songs and that his statue was depicted with a huge phallus. This has led some scholars to speculate that the worship of Freyr and Freyja might have involved real, ritualized sexual acts. The theory goes that these acts were a form of sympathetic magic, by performing a sexual union in a sacred space. The worshippers would encourage the gods to bestow fertility upon the land, the animals, and the people. This is a highly debated topic. Many historians are skeptical, arguing that Adam of Bremen was a Christian writer with a clear agenda to portray the pagans as depraved and immoral. There is no direct archaeological evidence, like a temple explicitly identified as a site for ritual sex. The academic debate is fierce. One side argues that we shouldn't dismiss these accounts out of hand and that ritualized sexuality is a known feature of many ancient fertility cults around the world. They suggest that the open and pragmatic Norse attitude towards sex makes this a plausible, if unproven, practice. The other side argues that it's a classic example of a barbarian role, where a more civilized culture projects its own sexual anxieties and taboos onto another. They maintain that without more concrete proof, the idea of sacred prostitution remains pure speculation. What is certain is that the Vikings saw the forces of fertility as sacred and powerful. The act of sex was not inherently sinful or shameful. It was a natural, vital part of the cosmic cycle. A childless marriage wasn't a moral failing. It was a practical disaster, a sign that the couple was out of sync with the generative forces of the universe represented by Freyr and Freyja. The rituals surrounding marriage, like placing Thor's hammer in the bride's lap, were attempts to harness this divine energy and bring it into the human household. So, as you stand on your farm, looking out at the fields, you see more than just dirt and crops. You see the domain of Freyr. You hope he will bless your land with a good harvest. When you look at your wife, pregnant with your child, you see the power of Freyja at work. And in your prayers and small household rituals, you are not just asking for things. You are trying to align your small human life with the great, powerful, and sometimes chaotic energies that flow from the gods. your understanding of sex, family, and survival is completely intertwined with this vibrant and very earthy, divine world. The world we've been exploring, this world of longhouses, honor feuds, and gods of fertility, was not static. It was changing, and the single greatest agent of that change was a new religion arriving from the south, carried by missionaries, merchants, and converted kings. It was a religion with a single, powerful God, a different set of ethics, and a radically different view on sex, marriage, and the role of women. The cross was beginning to replace the hammer. The Christianization of Scandinavia was a slow, complex, and often messy process that stretched over several centuries, from roughly the 9th to the 12th century. It wasn't a single event, but a gradual infiltration of new ideas that slowly eroded the foundations of the old Norse worldview. At first, the new religion was just one among many. A Viking trader might hedge his bets, making an offering to Freyr for a good harvest and also getting baptized by a priest in a foreign port just in case the White Christ, as they called him, was powerful too. But as Scandinavian kings began to see the political advantages of converting, it facilitated alliances with the powerful Christian kingdoms of Europe and centralized their own authority. The new religion gained momentum, and with it came a whole new set of rules about how men and women should interact. The first major clash was over the institution of marriage. As we've seen, Viking marriage was a private contract between the families, a business deal focused on property and heirs. Christian marriage was something entirely different. It was a sacrament, a holy vow made before God, administered by the church. The church began to assert its authority, insisting that a marriage was not valid unless it was blessed by a priest. This took the power of marriage out of the hands of families and placed it in the hands of a new religious institution. The new Christian laws brought sweeping changes. The church strongly condemned the keeping of concubines, the thrall. A man could have only one wife, and the union was, in theory, for life. This was a direct assault on the traditional Viking practice of polygyny as a display of status. A powerful jarl could no longer have a wife and several official mistresses. He had to choose one. This had massive social repercussions, affecting inheritance and the status of countless women and children. Divorce, which had been a relatively straightforward if serious contractual matter in the old Norse world, became nearly impossible. The church taught that marriage was an unbreakable sacrament. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. A woman who had been able to divorce her husband for hitting her or for failing to provide for her lost that right. She was now bound to him for life, for better or worse. Her legal and economic autonomy was significantly curtailed. This is where we find a fascinating detail of the transition, the remarrying of couples. As Christianity took hold, many couples who had been married for years under the old pagan laws were pressured to have their unions re-sanctified by a priest. This was a public declaration of their acceptance of the new faith and the new rules. It must have been a strange experience for a man and woman who had been partners for 20 years, with grown children, to suddenly be told that their lifelong union wasn't official until a man in a robe said some words over them. The clash of these two systems is a major focus of scholarly work on this period. Historians debate the impact of Christianization on the lives of women. On one hand, the Church's stance against the chaotic system of concubines and easy divorce might have offered some women a new kind of stability and security within a monogamous marriage. The Church also officially condemned infanticide, the Bar, teaching that every life was sacred in the eyes of God. On the other hand, many scholars argue that for the average free woman, the HUS Freja, Christianization represented a significant loss of power and agency. She lost the right to initiate divorce. Her role shifted from being a partner in a household firm to being her husband's subordinate in a divinely ordained hierarchy. The new religion brought with it a deep-seated suspicion of female sexuality that was entirely alien to the old pagan world of Phrygia. Sex was no longer a natural, life-giving force. It was now freighted with concepts of sin and temptation, permissible only within sacramental marriage and strictly for the purpose of procreation. You are living through this transition. Your grandfather worshipped Odin and Thor. Your father was baptized for political reasons, but still made quiet offerings to Freyr just in case. You, however, are being raised in a world where the church bells are beginning to drown out the scouts' epic poems. The priest in the new wooden church at the edge of the village preaches against the old ways, calling them sinful and barbaric. You hear stories of a man in a neighboring village being fined by the local chieftain, now calling himself a duke for having a frillet. You see a woman, known to be in an unhappy and abusive marriage, being told by the priest that her suffering is a test from God and that her only recourse is prayer. The old, familiar world of clear contracts and personal honor is being replaced by a new, more complex world of sin, penance, and divine law. The rules that have governed your people's lives for centuries are being rewritten, and the vibrant, chaotic, and often brutal world of Viking sexuality is slowly but surely being tamed and reshaped by the strict doctrines of the cross. The sun is setting on the world we've come to know. It's not a sudden darkness, but a long, slow twilight, a gradual fading of the old colors. The longhouse, once the vibrant center of a clan's universe, is slowly being overshadowed by the stone church, the chieftain's high seat. Once the ultimate seat of authority, now has to compete with the bishop's throne. The Viking Age is not ending with a cataclysmic battle, but with the quiet, relentless pressure of assimilation. You are now an old man or woman, living in the late 11th or early 12th century. You remember a different time. You remember the stories your grandmother told you, tales of the old gods, of feuds settled by the sword, of marriages that were family alliances. Now, you look at your grandchildren, and you see they live in a different reality. The old customs, once the bedrock of society, are now seen as relics of a pagan past, something to be whispered about with a mixture of nostalgia and shame. The practice of taking a frillet has been driven underground, now labeled as adultery and considered a grave sin. A man who does so risks not just social scorn but excommunication from the church. A spiritual death sentence that terrifies your grandchildren in a way that being called they are terrified your own generation. The concept of honor, once a public, measurable quality defended with violence, is being transformed. The church teaches a new kind of morality based on inner virtue, humility, forgiveness, and piety. The idea of launching a blunt feud over a verbal insult is now seen as barbaric and unlawful. The king, with the backing of the church, has established new laws in courts that claim a monopoly on justice. The home gang is outlawed. If your neighbor insults you now, you are supposed to sue him in the king's court. Or worse, turn the other cheek. To you, this seems like cowardice, a failure to defend one's name. To your grandchildren, it is simply the law. The slave trade, the dark engine of the Viking economy, is also grinding to a halt, at least in its old form. The church officially condemned the enslavement of fellow Christians. While this didn't end servitude overnight, a new system of serfdom was already taking its place. It dismantled the great international slave markets. It was no longer acceptable for a Scandinavian lord to raid a Christian village in Ireland and sell the captives in a public market. The economic foundation of the old warrior aristocracy has been pulled out from under them. They must now become feudal landlords, managing their estates and collecting rents. A far cry from the life of a seafaring raider. This brings us to a specific, and rather sad, detail of this decline: the fate of the old stories, the epic poems and myths. The sagas, which were once a living oral tradition recited by skalds in every longhouse, are now in danger of being forgotten. They are seen by the clergy as tales of violent, sinful pagans. However, in a strange twist of fate, it is Christian monks and scholars, particularly in Iceland, who will end up saving them. Men like Snorri Sturluson, a 13th century Icelandic chieftain and scholar, recognized the cultural value of these old stories. They began to write them down, preserving them for future generations. But they did so through a Christian lens. They often added prefaces explaining that these were just stories, not true beliefs, and sometimes reinterpreted the myths to fit a Christian framework. For example, they might suggest the old gods were not deities, but were actually great human kings from Troy who were mistakenly worshipped after their deaths. This process of preservation and alteration is a source of endless debate among modern scholars. When we read the sagas or the prose edit today, are we getting a pure, unadulterated glimpse into the Viking mind? Or are we reading a version that has been filtered, edited, and Christianized by the men who wrote it down? How much of the original meaning was lost or deliberately changed? Scholars meticulously analyze the texts, trying to peel back the layers of Christian influence to find the pagan core. But it's a difficult, and perhaps impossible, task. The sagas are a priceless treasure, but they are also a beautiful, frustratingly complex echo of a lost world. You sit by your own fire, in a smaller house now, not a communal longhouse. Privacy, once an unknown luxury, has become the norm. You watch your grandson carefully composing a letter, a skill you never needed. He is learning Latin from the local priest. His world is one of written contracts, church ties, and feudal obligations. He has heard the old stories, but to him, they are just that, stories. Fantastical tales of giants and dragons and hot-headed ancestors who fought duels over insults. You feel a sense of profound loss. The world you grew up in, with its harsh clarity, its brutal but understandable codes of honor and vengeance, has dissolved. It has been replaced by something more orderly, perhaps more peaceful, but also less vibrant. The old gods are silent. The long ships rot on the shore. A new age has dawned, an age of kings and bishops, of stone castles and parish churches. The old world, the true Viking Age, now lives on only in the memories of the olden, the edited manuscripts of the learned. The twilight has deepened in tonight, so here we are, at the end of our journey. We have traveled from the smoky, communal longhouse to the cold stone of the first churches. We've witnessed the brutal pragmatism of a marriage negotiation, the terror of a raid, and the slow, inexorable fading of an entire way of life. We are left standing in the ruins of the Viking world, trying to make sense of the echoes. Where does all our information, all these stories and details, actually come from? And how much of it can we trust? The foundation of our knowledge rests on three main pillars, each one a little shaky in its own way. The first, and most captivating, is the literary evidence. The sagas and the Eddic poems. These are the stories the Vikings, or at least their descendants, told about themselves. The sagas of the Icelanders, like NJL saga or Laxdala saga, are sprawling, novelistic accounts of family feuds, love, honor, and lore. The mythological poems of the Poetic Edda tell us the tales of Odin, Thor, and Freyja. They are our primary window into the Viking mindset, full of rich detail about their customs, beliefs, and what they value. But as we've seen, they are not straightforward historical documents. They were written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, 200 or 300 years after the end of the Viking Age proper, by Christian authors. They are to the Vikings what the tales of King Arthur are to the ancient Britons, a mixture of historical memory, literary invention, and contemporary values projected onto the past. They are filled with heroism, drama, and great speeches that a real 10th century farmer probably never uttered. They tell us what the 13th century Icelander thought about his Viking ancestors, which is not necessarily the same as how those ancestors actually lived. The second pillar is the external accounts, the writings of people who encountered the Vikings. We have the furious chronicles of Anglo-Saxon monks lamenting the destruction of their monasteries. We have the accounts of Frankish court historians detailing Viking attacks and treaties. And we have the fascinating, detailed observations of travelers like the Arab diplomat Ibn Fadl. These sources are invaluable because they are contemporary, a snapshot in time, but they too are biased. A monk whose home has just been burned is not going to give a neutral, objective report, and a abuse to the refined courts of Baghdad is going to be shocked and perhaps disgusted by the barbaric customs of the Rust raiders on the Volga. These accounts tell us how the Vikings were perceived by outsiders, which is a crucial but incomplete part of the story. The third pillar is the silent, physical evidence of archaeology. This is where we get our hands dirty. Archaeologists unearth the foundations of longhouses, the remains of ships, the graves of the dead. A skeleton can tell us about a person's diet, their health, the brutal labor they perform, the goods buried with them, their weapons, tools, and jewelry tell us about their status and perhaps their beliefs about the afterlife. The discovery of an Arabic coin in Sweden or a Norse-style brooch in Ukraine tells a story of trade and contact more reliable than any written text. Archaeology provides the hard, physical reality that we can test the literary stories against. And here we come to our final curious detail, one that perfectly encapsulates the challenge of interpreting this world. It concerns the famous Viking funeral. Popular culture, inspired by a romanticized reading of the sagas and a mistaken account by Ibn Fadl, gives us the image of a dead chieftain being pushed out to sea in a burning ship. For decades, archaeologists and historians dismissed this as pure fantasy. The archaeological evidence showed that high-status Vikings were buried, either in the ground under a mound or sometimes within a ship that was then buried under a mound. A ship burial. Yes, a flaming pyre on the water. No. But then, recent analysis of several famous ship burial sites, like the one at Osberger in Norway, has found evidence of large-scale ritual fires happening near the burial site as part of the funeral ceremonies. This has led to a reevaluation. Perhaps the sagas weren't describing the ship itself being burned at sea, but were conflating the two parts of the ritual, the ship burial and the massive funeral pyre. The debate perfectly illustrates the challenge. The sagas contain a kernel of truth. Ships, fire, and funerals were linked, but the literal details were likely a literary embellishment. We are constantly trying to reconcile the dramatic, often contradictory stories with the silent, ambiguous evidence from the ground. And that is the great, ongoing argument that defines the study of the Viking Age. How do we balance these three pillars? When a saga describes a legal practice that seems bizarre, and we find no archaeological proof, do we trust the text? When archaeology uncovers something that no text mentions, how do we interpret it? There are the saga steppers, who believe the texts are broadly reliable historical sources, and the skeptics, who think they are mostly literature and we should only trust the archaeology. Most scholars today walk a careful line between the two, using each type of evidence to question and illuminate the others. So, as we end our story, it's important to remember that this world we visited is a reconstruction. It's a picture painted with the bold, dramatic colors of the sagas, sketched over the hard, scientific lines of archaeology, and shaded with the biased accounts of their enemies and neighbors. The true picture of what sex, love, and life were really like in the Viking Age is something that history has, perhaps, lost forever, but in the fragments that remain, in the stories in the bones, we can still hear a powerful echo of a world that was complex, strategic, and often brutally, unsentimentally human. The embers in the longhouse fire have finally turned to gray ash. The last stories have been told. The world of the Vikings has receded, back into the mists of time from which it came. The journey we took was not one of simple facts and dates, but an attempt to feel the cold air, to smell the wood smoke, to understand the heavy weight of honor on a person's shoulders. We tried to glimpse the world through their eyes, to understand the logic so different from our own. And now, the journey is over. The sounds of the past fade away, replaced by the quiet hum of the world around you. Let the details we've explored tonight begin to soften and blur at the edges. Let the harshness of that world dissolve, leaving behind only the faintest impressions. Like a dream you can only half remember in the morning. Feel the solidness of your own bed, the gentle weight of your own blanket. You are safe in your own time, in your own space, far from the reach of long ships and the cold judgment of the longhouse. There's nothing more to analyze, nothing more to learn tonight. Your mind can let go of the stories. Let them drift away like smoke rising from a chimney into the vast, quiet night sky. Allow your breathing to slow, to deepen. Each breath pulls you further from the past and deeper into the present stillness. Each breath is a soft wave, washing away the thoughts of the day, leaving only calm in its wake. You are drifting now, on a quiet and peaceful sea, toward the gentle shores of sleep.